Good evening and welcome to the third segment of our interview with Dr. Charles Finch on the Egyptian origin of Christianity. We begin this segment by asking Dr. Finch, who is an assistant professor of community medicine and family practice at the Morehouse School of Medicine, to discuss another episode from the Gospels, which has a much earlier occurrence in the religion practiced by the early black Egyptians. That Gospel episode deals with the deaf and dumb man in the 7th chapter of Mark.
One of the things that you find in the opening of the mouth ceremony is the dead person reobtaining the word, because the word becomes the image of life. Now, we heard about how Jesus restores hearing to the deaf man by rubbing his ears and opening up his ears, and also about giving him giving him the word. This concept of the word, again, goes right back to the very sources of Egyptian religion, because the word is what brings all life, all creation into existence. Now, that being the case, when a man dies, he is said to be dumb. That is, deaf and dumb. That is, without the word. Now, in the earliest ritual, or the earliest part of the ritual of resurrection of the Egyptians, there is a ceremony called the opening of the mouth ceremony. After the man, there's a long ceremony of death and resurrection. And the first part of that, described ad infinitum on all the Egyptian descriptions, or religious descriptions, is the opening of the mouth ceremony. Now, that has been very obscure to a lot of people for a long time, what that meant, or what the significance of that was. And it wasn't always clear to me what it meant until, interestingly enough, my wife gave me the clue to the answer. Now, what she told me was, if you note the phenomenon of birth, when a baby comes out, the first sign of life in an infant is when the baby opens its mouth and cries, that is, issues a word. That is the image of life. Now, what happens, and I got to thinking about that, and I got to elaborate on it further. What happens when that baby opens its mouth and cries? Before that happens, it has to take an inrush of air or breath, i.e., an inrush of spirit, because in the Egyptian conception, breath and spirit are the same thing. And then it opens its mouth and utters the word, i.e., that which calls things into life, the word, of course, being the cry of the infant. Well, if you look at the opening of the mouth ceremony of the Egyptians, that is exactly what is happening when they're doing to the dead man. By opening of the mouth, they are symbolically creating a situation where the spirit can enter, the dead man can open his mouth symbolically and utter the word, and therefore restore himself to life. And we find that again, allegorically or symbolically, in the very natural phenomenon of childbirth.
Okay. Let's get back to Shu. Explain what Shu was.
Okay, I'm sorry. Shu is...
I want to make a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, Shu is the god of air. Okay. He is the god of air, the god of wind, but he is also the Egyptian form of the later Greek Atlas, because he is the one who separates the earth from the sky, and you see him represented with his hands separating the earth from the sky. And he is the one, interestingly enough, that divides the firmaments.
Okay. Divides
the firmaments by separating the waters of the heavens from the waters below.
But you mentioned the sneezing thing.
Yes. Well,
I said that because when I was growing up, we'd sneeze, we'd say, "Hashu."
Yeah.
And so when you said that really, I wondered.
Exactly. Well,
that's what we used to say. When after you literally sneeze, and then you're playing, you say "Hashu."
Well, I'm going to throw a big Greek word at you. It's called onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia. It means that word which sounds like the thing that it represents, i.e., the word boom is an onomatopoeic word. It means it sounds like the thing that you're trying to represent. The word bang is a similar onomatopoeic word. It sounds like the thing you're trying to represent. Well, the Egyptian language is chock full of words and meanings that are words that have meanings that are onomatopoeic in origin. And shu is a clear example of that, of the act of expelling breath in a sneeze, giving you the achu or the hachu, and they Egyptians taking that sound and creating a word meaning something divine out of it. Now, interestingly enough, the reason why we say bless you after we sneeze, or someone says bless you to somebody after you sneeze, is because, remember, we're talking about air being the spirit of life. By sneezing, you are, in a way, expelling the breath of life, expelling the spirit of life. So bless you is a way of reanimating you, so to speak, of restoring that breath back to you, so that life can continue.
So now we know the whole story. Let me throw some words from the Christian vocabulary past you and ask you to tell us where they come from. Messiah.
Messiah. Okay. Messiah, traditionally speaking, is a Hebrew or Aramaic word. Means the anointed one or the anointed king. It comes from its root is from the Egyptian word mes, M-E-S, which means born of, birth, child of, son of. Sometimes young man, too. Okay? The Messiah, therefore, is the anointed king. Its root has to be M-E-S. One of the Egyptian deities was Iu, who was the prototype of the god Yah, who was a prototype of Jehovah or Yahweh. Now, if you take the word mes, M-E-S, and add on to it you get Messiah, which means born of Yahweh or Jehovah, which gives you one of the aspects or manifestations of Jesus, or manifestations of the term Messiah. Okay? The Mesu, M-E-S-U, was also called the anointed child. So again, we have a Hebrew word taking its direct antecedents from the Egyptian concept and the Egyptian word.
Christ.
Now, Christ, the word Christ comes directly from the Greek word Christos, K-R-I-S-T-O-S. It is a word that means anointed, and is a Greek translation directly from the Hebrew word Messiah. Now, again, as you may expect, there is an Egyptian origin to that word, too. Now, one of the manifestations of Osiris was as the mummified resurrected one. The mummified resurrected one, and by definition, the mummified one is also the anointed one, because in the process of mummification, they use special oils and myrrhs and things like that to wrap up or do the process of mummification. And then, of course, as a part of the ritual of resurrection, the mummy is anointed. So he is the mummified one. He is the anointed mummified one. Now, the Egyptian word for the anointed mummy in the form of Osiris is karast. Now, if you, again, take the Egyptian letters, and transliterate them directly, they come out like this. Now, before I get to that, let me just back up a little bit and show the audience, if they can
push it back to you somewhere.
Yeah, if they can focus in on this chart a little bit. Here is the Greek word asar, as we talked about before. Here is the Egyptian word asar, as we talked about before. Here is the Greek word Osiris. Osiris is just a Greek form of the word asar. Here is the Egyptian word ast. Here is the Greek word Isis. Here is the Egyptian word Heru. We talked about that earlier. And here is the Greek word Horus. Now, the karast mummy that we talked about, the anointed, mummified, resurrected one, is spelt this, K-R-S-T, if you transliterate it directly. Compare this to the Greek word for the anointed, resurrected one, Christos, which gives us our word, Christ. So again, you take our word Christ, which means the anointed one, the resurrected one, it goes right back to the Egyptian origin, Christ. And again, that relates to the anointed one, who is the mummified one, and who is therefore the resurrected one. So again, we see a direct connection, not merely a parallel, but a direct connection between a word and a concept, which is fundamental to our conception of our religion, that is Christ, going back to an Egyptian original.
And this one I found fascinating, Lazarus.
Yes, Lazarus. A number of scholars and researchers had made mention of the nature of Lazarus as depicted in the Gospels. Now, let's recount who Lazarus is in the Christian Gospels. He is the brother of two sisters, Martha and Mary. He dies. Martha and Mary go to Jesus and ask him to come to see and administer to their brother Lazarus, who had died. Jesus comes, first of all, he says, I am the resurrection and I am the life. He comes to Lazarus. He says to Lazarus, Lazarus, rise and come forth. Rise and come forth. Lazarus comes out swathed in linen bandages, rises up, and it comes out, walks out, swathed in linen bandages. Okay, let's take the example of Osiris. Osiris has two sisters, Isis and Nephthys. He dies, or he is the dead one, okay, murdered by his brother Seth. The two sisters are depicted as mourning over him, just the way Martha and Mary mourned over Lazarus. Then they call upon Horus, who is Osiris' son, to come and minister to him. Osiris anoints him and then tells him to rise and come forth to thy house. In some versions of this story, it is the two sisters who say, rise and come forth. But in others, it is Horus, and you actually see him, Horus telling the mummified Osiris to rise up and come forth. Osiris comes up wrapped in linen bandages in mummified form, just like Lazarus rises and comes forth, wrapped in linen bandages. So again, if you look at the parallels between the two episodes, they are almost identical. Just almost the names have been changed. But it gets even more interesting when you consider the name of Lazarus himself. We have to break down the name Lazarus in this fashion. I almost think I should write this down, but I think it'd be difficult in the circumstances.
You'll put it on the screen.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You can break down Lazarus as L, capital L, dash Azar, A-Z-A-R, which is the middle name of the word Lazarus, and then the terminal is U-S. Okay? Let's break it down linguistically or etymologically. The letter L is equivalent to in the Semitic languages, El, which means the. We see this, by the way, in Spanish, which L also means the. L in French, L-E, le, also means the. So what I'm saying is that word L in the word Lazarus means the. It is what we call, I think, the definitive article. Now, Azar, which is the middle part, and therefore the real part of Lazarus' name, L-A-Z-A-R, is equivalent to this word, Asar, which means Osiris. Now, for a long time, I looked at that terminal, us, in Lazarus, us, U-S, as being a form that converted into a Latin type of the name. But then I was looking through the Egyptian dictionary, and I came across a little word, A-S, A with a little dot over it, as. Now, the meaning of that word is to call or to hail. So if you put them all together, El, meaning the, Azar, meaning Osiris, As, meaning called or to hail. The word Lazarus therefore means the Osiris called forth.
Now, what time span are we talking about? The time span between Lazarus, the Lazarus story, and the Osirian drama?
Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years, maybe 4,000.
The Lazarus thing coming later.
Much later. The Lazarus thing coming during the Christian era, which is, in the, I forget which gospel it is, but remember, the first gospel was written sometime, we'll talk about this later, sometime 80 to 89 A.D. The last gospel was written about 120 A.D. So you're talking about 100 years A.D., 100 years A.D. more or less, and you're talking about the Osiris story going back 3,000 to 4,000 years.
Okay. Now let me get clear on what you're saying here, and are you saying that the Lazarus thing was taken directly? Lazarus story was taken directly.
It had to have been.
Mm-hmm.
It had to have been.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk maybe a little later, if you want to, about how that happened, or what was the transition. What was the transition between the Kemetic religion and?
Well, I think you can mention it now if you want to. Could you?
There are yes. It's a little complicated, but we can reduce it down to basically this. On the one hand, you had the religion of Osiris and Isis being the one form of Egyptian religion which survived the demise of Egypt itself, particularly the cult of Isis and her husband Serapis, which was a form of Osiris. Now, Isis became a very, very vigorous and popular cult or religion among the Ptolemies, that is, the Greek people who ruled Egypt in the last 300 years B.C. She was always figured, by the way, always shown as a black female figure with holding a black baby. When Rome conquered Egypt, the Isis cult, again and actually she was in this sense more predominant than Osiris, interestingly enough. Osiris, even though he was part of this as Serapis, he was not nearly as important as Isis and her infant Horus. The Isis cult, Isis-Serapis cult, moves or is transported to Rome, and despite great opposition, not only survives there, but flourishes there. And again, you're talking about a homegrown Egyptian religion that is taken up not only by the Greeks of Alexandria, but also eventually by large segments of the Roman population and of the Roman Empire. The cult of Isis becomes so important, so vigorous, and so popular that in terms of just sheer number of adherents or worshipers, it rivals the cult or the religion of Jupiter and of Mithra. The Roman soldiers, when they conquer Europe, take her cult, take her religion and her figure all over the parts of Europe where they conquered, in what is today Spain, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy. And they set up shrines to her, the black Isis with the black child. Christianity in 400, 500 A.D. also later on moves into Europe. And instead of destroying those shrines, because they had such a hold on the populace, they took that black Isis and child and turned it into the black Madonna and child, i.e.
And this black Isis, physiologically speaking, in terms of its physiognomy,
African, no question about
African.
it. In fact,
not just black on the surface.
No. Because if you look at some of the frescoes in Pompeii, and they show the practice of the cult or the religion of Isis, she is depicted again as an African or Ethiopian-looking woman, and all of her priests invariably are Ethiopians, always, at least in that fresco.
Okay.
So that is one way in which Egyptian religious ideas through Isis, the cult of Isis, very readily made its gain currency throughout the Mediterranean. And in fact, many commentators in Rome said that in the early days of Christianity, said they couldn't see any difference between Christians and those who worship Serapis and Isis because their practices were so closely the same. Then there are the Essenes. Now, again, the Essenes are a very obscure sect of Judaism who lived in isolated communities as brotherhoods, practiced a form of communal worship and communal sharing of all things, were vegetarians, worshiped the Great Mother and Child, practiced a very, very peaceful form of living, and their most important center was in Egypt. And if you look at some of the Essene Gospels, it is clear that very pronounced Egyptian ideas and concepts crept into Essenism, which was an offshoot of Judaism. Okay, that's one thing. Then there is what we call the Gnostic or Hermetic tradition. That is the Greeks who lived in Egypt for 300 years, took Egyptian ideas and gave them a Greek gloss, so to speak. And that became known as Hermeticism and Gnosticism as two of the forms. And again, particularly since Greek was the most widely spoken language, the lingua franca of all the Mediterranean, those ideas spread out all over the Mediterranean. So you see three areas in which, or three modes of transmission of Egyptian religious and metaphysical ideas into the general body of Christianity, because Christianity absorbed all of the important religious ideas that were current in that part of the world at that time, at least the most important ones, and most of the ones that had any real currency, you can trace them right back to Egypt through those three paths that I just mentioned. Okay.
Next word, Mass.
Mass. Okay. The Mass is the Catholic Christian sacrifice, the Eucharist. Okay. 2,000-year-old ceremony. It is the eating of the body and the blood of Jesus Christ in the form of bread and wine. Now, you take that word Mass, and it is derived directly. And the Mass, I should say, is directly centers around the supper. The Last Supper sort of gives you the inspiration, or is the central idea of the Mass. So the idea of the eating of the meal, of the sacramental meal, is central to the idea of the Mass. Capital M-A-S-S. That comes from the Egyptian word mes, M-E-S. By the way, we talked about that later. One of the other meanings of the Egyptian word mes is the evening supper or the evening bread.
Okay. Finally, you talked about this before, but if you can go over it again, Satan.
Yes, I mentioned that the god Set, who became the great adversary in the Osirian drama, lends not only his prototype or his archetype, but also his name to the word Satan. But it even goes further than that. If you look at the medieval iconography, that is the medieval creation of religious images, Satan is represented as a red-colored being with cloven hooves, of a tail, forked tail, and horns. Okay? Set's color, sacred color, was red, and he was called the Red One. He was personified in one of his manifestations as the goat. Therefore, the horns and the cloven hooves. So, even if you look at the Christian iconography of Satan, the principle of evil, that too seems to have been taken almost directly out of Egyptian representations of the great adversary.
In your paper, you give an interesting explanation of the term spirit by writing about Osiris as a corn or grain deity.
Okay. Well, this is one aspect of what that concept spirit meant.
Okay.
Now, in one of his manifestations or aspects, Osiris was the personification of the grape. And if you remember when I said earlier, he was the one who taught mankind the science of the cultivation of the grape. Okay? Wine is considered the blood of the grape. And therefore, it is the blood of Osiris. It is also, because of its intoxicating properties, called the spirit of the grape, and therefore the spirit of Osiris. Therefore, to imbibe wine or drink wine was drinking the blood and the spirit of Osiris. The reason we give the term spirits today to alcoholic beverages derives from that original early concept of the spirit of the grape. Now, you notice that Osiris, again, is the personification of the wine. The wine is, in some sense, his blood. Osiris is also, in fact, in his earliest manifestation, he is a corn or grain deity. And there are representations of him lying flat with stalks of grain growing out from his body. And therefore, he becomes one of his personifications becomes that of the bread. And indeed, in the ancient Egyptian, when you break the bread, you are reenacting the dismemberment of the body of Osiris. So, when you eat the bread in the Egyptian sacrament, you're eating, and when you break the bread, you are dismembering of the body of Osiris and eating the body of Osiris. When you drink the wine, you are eating the blood, drinking the blood of Osiris. Again, relates directly to the sacramental meal of the Last Supper and to the Mass, in which it is said, "Take ye and eat of it, for this is my body." And they take the wafer, which is a form of unleavened bread, and give it to the communicant. "Take ye and drink of this, for this is my blood." And they take some wine and give it to the communicant. So it becomes almost inescapable that the fundamental rituals of Christianity come directly out of the original Egyptian.
Become a part of it.
The cult of Isis becomes so important, so vigorous, and so popular that in terms of just sheer number of adherents or worshipers, it rivals the cult or the religion of Jupiter and of Mithra. The Roman soldiers, when they conquer Europe, take her cult, take her religion, her figure, all over the parts of Europe where they conquered, and what is today Spain, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and they set up shrines to her, the Black Isis with the Black Child. Christianity in 400, 500 AD also later on moves into Europe. And instead of destroying those shrines, because they had such a hold on the populace, they took that Black Isis and Child and turned it into the Black Madonna and Child. I.e.,
and this Black Isis, physiologically speaking, in terms of its physiognomy,
African, no question about
African.
it. In fact,
not just black on the surface.
No. Because if you look at some of the frescoes in Pompeii, and they show the practice of the cult or the religion of Isis, she is depicted again as an African or Ethiopian-looking woman, and all of her priests invariably are Ethiopians, always, at least in that fresco.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the final segment of our interview with Dr. Charles Finch of the Morehouse School of Medicine on the Egyptian origin of Christianity. In this segment, we asked Dr. Finch to describe the first human representation of Jesus Christ.
I should preface that by saying is that in the Christian iconography of about the first 4 centuries or so, or even longer, when I say iconography, I mean representations of religious images. There was no human figure of Jesus ever represented. There was no human figure placed on the cross as the crucified figure. There were no human figures of Jesus painted or pictured. That didn't come until rather late, or I shouldn't say late, but later, well on after Christianity had been well established. some of the earliest forms of the Egyptian, or of Jesus, was among the Coptic peoples. And the Coptic peoples probably have the oldest tradition of Christianity still extant. They live in Egypt even today. And if you look at some of their earliest depictions of the human figure of Jesus, you see a figure who has peppercorn African hair, very thick lips and broad noses and dark skin. Then there is a coin of Justinian. Justinian reigned in about the 5th or 6th century A.D. in Rome. And on the opposite side of the coin of Justinian, of this particular, Justinian didn't reign in Rome. I think he reigned in Byzantium, or the eastern part of the Roman Empire. But in any case, there is a coin that has his picture on it, and on the obverse, on the opposite side of the coin, is a picture of Jesus. And again, this picture of Jesus has a man with the peppercorn hair and black of skin. And so these are two of the earliest representations of the figure of Jesus, and they are represented as a black man.
Now, this is all happening before people had racial hang-ups, or what?
Yes, you might say that.
Or what? I mean, today somebody might say, well, I might not understand how a black goddess or a black god can be accepted by people whose skin might be white in different parts of the world.
Well, that brings us to another question. Racism, as we now experience and understanding it, is a relatively recent phenomenon in history. And particularly modern racism was directly fueled and really created by the historical experience of slavery and colonialism that were experienced by Afro-American peoples in this entire hemisphere. But whatever you may say, ill or good, about the Greeks and Romans of antiquity, racism in the modern sense of the word did not seem to be one of their failings. Now, it's not to say that they did not have an ethnocentrism, that they did not believe themselves superior to other peoples, but it was their superiority, or their sense of superiority to other peoples, was never based on any racial factors. In fact, if you look at their descriptions of other peoples in the world, the peoples who they seem to have the most admiration for were the Ethiopians and Egyptians, particularly the Ethiopians. And you see that among the Greeks. And Homer describes the Greek gods, Zeus, the highest Greek god, the most important Greek god, when he comes down to earth to mingle among humankind, he doesn't go and mingle among the Greeks. He goes and mingles among the blameless Ethiopians. So Homer says this. And so racism, as we understand it, did not exist in the low antiquity, or the period of the Greek and Romans, to anything like it does today. So that, and the more enlightened Greeks and Romans were very, very cognizant of where some of their religious forms and practices came from, and they had no hesitation about admitting such. Everyone from Herodotus to Diodorus to Pliny to Plutarch and Ovid and Lucian, who wrote the Metamorphosis, or the Golden Ass, were very ready to admit that many of the religious practices of Greece and Rome came right out of Egypt and Africa beyond. So they had no. So for them, there was no the racial identity of Jesus was no issue for them. It didn't matter.
Tell us something about the historical Jesus, please.
Okay. The one thing about the gospel Jesus that seems to really strike the enlightened and impartial investigator is that there's grave questions whether he ever existed, at least as depicted in the Gospels. I mean, that figure pictured in the Gospels, although it may have had a core of historical truth, seems to be somebody who could not possibly exist. And that's not just based on internal evidence.
Are we talking to a Catholic?
Yes.
You?
Yes, I am a practicing Catholic. Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead.
Indeed. I was born and raised a Catholic, and practiced, and I'm now a practicing Catholic. If you look at the independent commentators writing in the Greco-Roman Hebraic world of that time, Philo-Judaeus, Tacitus, even Josephus, although there's supposedly some reference to the Christians in Josephus, but people have later found out to be a forgery. If you look at the writers, both religious and secular, who would have been expected to know something about a man as described in the Gospels, the record is almost entirely silent. The only reference to the man Jesus as described in the Gospels comes from the Gospels themselves. The only reliable, all other reliable records or reliable references to that man do not exist, which does not say there was not a historical Jesus, because there indubitably was. The only man in the historical record who can be considered to have been the historical Jesus is a man by the name of Joshua or Jeshu ben Pandera, Joshua, son of the Panther, who was born about 120 BC, who lived in Egypt a good part of his life and became an Essene and studied under an Essene sage. Now remember, we said earlier that Essenism, as a sect of Judaism, was strongly steeped and influenced by the doctrines of Egyptian religion. He was the disciple of a Essene sage by the name of Ben Parachia. Somewhere in his 4th or 5th decade, he left Egypt, went into what is today Palestine, and began teaching and healing the sick, and even the record says, performing wonders of various kinds. He was arrested by the magistrates, Jewish magistrates, tried and convicted for practicing magic, quote unquote, because to practice magic is a capital offense in Hebrew law. He was convicted and therefore was hanged on the Passover in 70 BC in a place called Lydda. So you can see in this individual, who was a historical person, who evidently was a very wise, a very compassionate individual who had healing powers, and who was obviously a mystic, a great teacher, who, because of his life and his work, stirred up the authorities against him and for that reason lost his life. You can see the skeleton of the outline of the story of Jesus as we understand it. Now, what I surmise happened, and this is a surmise and opinion, and I have to state it as such, is that the Savior mythology that was extant in the world at that time, as we have personified through our discussion of the Egyptian religion, coalesced around this person, Jeshu ben Pandera. In fact, the word Jesus, the name Jesus, is a Greek word, or Greek form of the name Joshua or Jeshu. So Jesus is really Joshua or Jeshu. Okay. And this man was named Jeshu or Joshua ben Pandera. Now, at that time in the world, the entire world, at least all of the Mediterranean world, was expecting a Messiah or a great figure to appear and usher in a new age. So there was this tremendous expectation of this person. And it seems to me that that expectation and the corpus of mythology and symbolism that already existed and had already been existing for maybe 4,000 years sort of settled around this person, giving rise to the canonical Gospels and therefore what we call historical Christianity. One thing you must realize, there were maybe a dozen or more Gospels. 4 were selected as being canonical. That means correct or acceptable or orthodox. The others were called apocryphal or false Gospels. So they chose, there were many Gospels and only 4 were taken. There were many other sects that had attributes that were very similar to what Christianity practiced in that time. But Christianity is the one to survive. My own surmise historically as to why Christianity was able to emerge as just an offshoot of Judaism. It was just, for a long time, considered just a sect of Judaism, a form of Judaism, just a obscure, insignificant little Judaistic sect. Has to do with the fall of the temple in 70 A.D. Up to that time, the Jewish religion, the Hebrew religion, had an expectation of an earthly Messiah who would come and free them from their oppressors and inaugurate a golden age. What discredited that idea, that messianic idea, was the fall of the Temple of Jerusalem when the Romans captured Jerusalem in 70 A.D. and destroyed the temple and dispersed the Jews. What that meant then was that the Christian idea that the Messiah, or the great man that was expected, was not an earthly figure or historical figure, but it was a spiritual Messiah, and it was a spiritual kingdom that was meant in these prophecies and in this expectation. Therefore, gained credibility or credence, because this expectation of an earthly Messiah was found to be, was just discredited because it failed against the might of the Roman legions. So you find very soon after that the what we call the canonical Gospels cropping up, obviously taken from the vast corpus of religion and mythology and metaphysics and symbols already existing, and put together in the form of a history or a pseudo-history of a man that existed, true, but that the history being created in such a way that it reflected a transcendent, shall we say, a mythical personage. And that this gained credence because of the fall of the temple. So it's interesting that the Gospels that we use as the foundation of Christianity begin about 80 A.D. And the last Gospel was written about 120 A.D. So yes, there was a historical Jesus.
Okay.
And let me just finish this thought. There was a man, Jesus. There was a man who was a great teacher, a great healer, a great leader, a man who was a succor to the poor, who was a comforter, a paraclete, to use the word, who apparently, at least tradition, assigns him the ability to work wonders, however you define that, i.e. miracles. And that man was indeed hanged on the Passover, i.e. At the equinox, just like Jesus was. But these things happened some 100 years before the time that the Jesus story is supposed to actually occur.
Okay. When you began to discover that Christianity had its roots in the religion of the black people of Egypt, how did you feel?
Well, I don't know how to answer that because it was such a gradual process. Okay.
What's the effect now? What's the total effect?
Well, let me just describe how it personally affected my own relationship to the religion of Christianity. I was born in the Christian church as a Catholic. When I was about 18 or 19, I basically left the Catholic Church for about 16 years. There was nothing in Christianity that spoke to me in any sense of the word. When I did return to Christianity, to the Catholic fold, so to speak, and I am a practicing Catholic, am now, my road back was through this road of Egypt, of seeing that the rituals that are still maintained, at least in the Catholic Church and in many Christian churches of all sects and all denominations, the rituals had an antiquity, had a history going back almost to the dawn of mankind, certainly to the dawn of civilization, dawn of history, perhaps even the dawn of consciousness. And that road led through Africa, out of Africa through Egypt. And it was those signposts, those ritualistic signposts out of Africa that survived in Christianity, particularly in the Catholic Church, that allowed me to go back. Because it is those things that speak to me. It is those rituals that speak to me, those things that recreate the incredible hoary antiquity of the Christhood. And I should say something about the Christhood because the Christhood is as old as humankind and human consciousness itself, because where Christianity has made its mistake among many is assuming that Christ was only a man, historical man, externally manifested in history. And that originally was not merely what he was supposed to have been. He was as much an external, real historical figure as he was an internal condition in the human being. He is the manifestation of the ultimate human possibility, and the ultimate human possibility is that which allows or gives the man a possibility of becoming as God himself. That Christ is the possibility within to become as God, to become as the God-man, so that the seed of divinity that's in every human being is manifested itself as the Christhood. So it is that emphasis, that total exclusive emphasis on Christ as an external figure that I think has been the detriment of Christianity, because it was not meant merely to be that. Although, yes, there was an external historical figure around which the religion coalesced. It was also meant to reflect or to in some way manifest or reveal the inner Christhood, which has a history, as I say, going back to the dawn of human consciousness, as we see, developed to its sublimest extent, or to a very sublime extent, in Africa through Egypt, in the Egyptian religion, in the Egyptian religious symbols, and forging a direct road out of the Osirian drama, out of the Kemetic religious system or mysteries, into historic Christianity. And that Christianity, if it would only allow itself to see, has a history or has a umbilical cord that goes back to the dawn of history. And indeed, I often like to think of it as of Christianity being the mouth of the delta of the Nile River, which has its beginnings, its umbilicus, in the Great Lakes of Africa, some 4,000 miles to the south. And Christianity is very much like that in its relationship to the Kemetic religion of Egypt and Africa.
How do you think most people will respond to this information?
Well, I think they would probably be frightened, as I mentioned, threatened, disturbed, angry, all of those things. I think a lot of black people will give it serious consideration, even in the process of being threatened by it. And the reason why I say this is because I have found that a number of clergymen who I've had conversations about this have expressed a tremendous amount of interest and have had listened to it with a very attentive ear. I always am fond of saying that this doesn't have to and really shouldn't threaten your faith. If anything, it should strengthen it. If you understand the true antecedents and the true roots of this religion that you are a part of. I have even, like I said, I am a Catholic, and I've even given my talk about this before a couple of black Catholic priests. And again, got at least an attentive ear. And that's basically all you can ask for, is an enlightened, an impartial, well, maybe not impartial, but certainly an ear that listens with a willingness to listen seriously to it, if it's valid, so that it should be rebutted or validated on its merits.
No.
Which, by the way, I also should mention may be a little impossible, because there's nothing about religion that is rational in that sense. I mean, a person's religion is as close to him or her as anything or everything else about him or her. And it's not anything that one can have a rational look at or a rational response to or a rational view of. So that may be asking a lot. But what I find is that if I had been talking like this, say, 5 or 10 years ago, I probably would have gotten a deaf ear all around. But I think that there is now a willingness to re-look at, to re-examine this faith for a whole lot of reasons, not the least of which have to do with political, cultural, social changes that have been going on in our society. And also because I begin to think that a lot of people, black and white, are tired of the same old platitudes being recycled. I mean, you go listen to a sermon or go and listen to someone preach, and they're saying the same things that basically they've been saying for generations on end, and it has lost its capacity to inform, let alone fulfill. So I do not offer this, by the way, as an antidote to that. No, I do not offer that for that reason, although some people have taken it in that light. I offer it because it is, from my perspective, the truth.
What should this information do for black and white people?
You know, it should make them realize that the truth will out. Now, the fact that this information I've been discussing and all this I have been saying has been suppressed and repressed for, well on 2,000 years, and it has been, says something right there. It says something about Christianity such as we practice it today was not meant to be predicated on the truthful or valid experiences of man in any fashion, spiritual, religious, social, political, or otherwise. And in fact, after the 3rd century, what happened to Christianity is it became an instrument of control, social and political control. And none of us can be blind to the outright crimes against humanity perpetuated in the name of Christ. Can't turn a blind eye to that. And if what I'm doing is holding up a mirror to Christianity, and those who profess Christianity do not like what they see in the mirror, well, that's very often what happens when the truth will out. When the truth is out, it forges itself into, as people have said, a two-way sword, and it cuts both ways. And it can be very, very painful. It can even be devastating. Either you will just turn a blind, you will shut your eyes so you cannot see, close your ears so you cannot hear, and tape over your mouth so you will not speak. Well, if that is the response, that is the response.
But most growth can be painful, right?
Well, I think all growth and liberation, I might add, is by definition painful. Even physiologically, that young people experience growing pains. And certainly Christianity, to a large extent, has lost its capacity to engage the mass number of its followers, to really give meaning and substance to their lives, no matter how many people claim to be born-again Christians, or how many people claim to listen to the old-time gospel hour, or how many followers of this or that or the other denomination of Christianity there exists. There's no question that Christianity and its leaders every day are losing the ability to mold the minds, let alone the spirits, of the people who profess Christianity. And part of that is because the lie that has been told in behalf of Christianity is the real blasphemy. Things that I'm talking about are not blasphemous. The truth is never blasphemous. The blasphemy comes for the willful perversion and distortion of the truth, particularly when it is used to the ends of controlling people and ruling people. That is the blasphemy. And the truth always stands by itself, and you can never suppress it forever. So that perhaps beginning to deal with this is a way of beginning to deal with the truth within oneself. Because as I say, the Christhood is within as well as without. And it is that what man intrinsically is. And without getting too metaphysical about it, it was going to come out one way or the other, from somebody, from some quarter, from some source. If I happen to be one of those persons that's doing that, so be it. But if I hadn't, somebody else would have, or it would have in some other fashion. And it's only on that basis that a true reclaiming of Christianity as it was meant to be can begin to happen.
Thank you, sir. In our post-conversation with Dr. Finch, he told me that Eve, in the much older Egyptian language, spelled Yeth YF, spelled Yif, means great mother or serpent. Adam, or Atem, A-T-E-M, in the Egyptian language means first man or completion. Noah, or Nua, in the Egyptian language, N-U-A, means the great flood of the heavens. Nuhu, N-H-U.
Goodness, I thought we were going to church. Before I go any further, let me just say that Dr. Watkins has worked very hard at the medical school to ensure that there is a continual presence of African American students in medicine and in the postgraduate internships and residencies. And to that, I think he should be applauded, because for a long time he was singularly endeavoring to do that against all odds. And I just want to say, as he leaves, and before I introduce Dr. Finch, let me show you these two books. The first one is Echoes of the Old Dark Land, Themes from the African Eden. This is Dr. Finch's latest work. It is a wonderful work dealing with issues of origins of Christianity and origins of mankind, and I think you ought to get this book. It's outside when you leave. The second book here is The African Background to Medical Science, and this is a book written earlier. When was this book first done, Charlie? A year and a half ago. So you see, he's been real busy, real busy. So these two books are available, and please get your copy and get your autograph tonight while he's here, because he may not come back to Baltimore anymore. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce Charles Finch III. He is a board-certified family practice physician who is currently Assistant Director of Internal Health at Morehouse Medical School and a professor of medicine. He is a graduate of Yale College and a graduate of Thomas Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia. He completed his residency training in family medicine at the University of California, Irvine Medical Center, and subsequently spent 2 years as an epidemiologist with the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. Dr. Finch joined the Department of Family Medicine at Morehouse in 1982, where in the next 7 years he directed the Introduction to Clinical Methods, supervised the 4th-year clerkship for students in family medicine, and coordinated the geriatric teaching program. He joined the International Health Office in '89, where he became involved in a public health training project in Senegal, Africa, and oral rehydration research in the Caribbean. He is principal investigator of a traditional healing survey in Senegal which did begin in October of '91, and goes back and forth to Senegal, and 3 or 4 times a year. Dr. Finch has conducted private studies in African antiquities, comparative religion, and anthropology since 1971. Since 1982, he has published more than a dozen articles, including The African Background in Medical Science, The Kemetic Genesis of Christianity. For those of you who do not know that Kemetic is the ancient African word for that used to represent the land we now call Egypt, which was the foreign name given by the invaders. Race and Evolution, and Science and Symbol of Egyptian Medicine, commentaries on the Edmund Smith Papyrus. A collection of Dr. Finch's essays entitled The African Background to Medical Science, as I showed you earlier, was published by Carnac House in London. And this recent publication, Echoes of the Old Dark Land, Themes from the African Eden, was published by Kenty Publications in August of this past year. Dr. Finch has lectured over 300 times in the United States, England, Switzerland, and Egypt on diverse topics. He's traveled extensively in Africa, conducting numerous interviews with traditional healers. And in 1984, he co-chaired the infamous Nile Valley Conference when Sheikh Anta Diop came to the United States of America. And any of you all that know anything about African history know Sheikh Anta Diop came as close as anyone to being in the footsteps of Imhotep, the multi-genius. But I want to say that we have a follower in Sheikh Anta Diop's tradition, and that is Dr. Charles Finch, who combines a love of history, a love of anthropology, psychology, medicine, and of himself, as he's put together a series of information to bring us out of darkness into light. Baltimore, please welcome. Johns Hopkins, please welcome Dr. Charles Finch.
Thank you very much. Since it is my first trip, perhaps you ought to wait until the end before you see whether I deserve that standing ovation or not. Patricia Newton, the irrepressible, indomitable Patricia Newton, as you know, very few people can say no to Patricia Newton. Very few people can contradict Patricia Newton. Very few people can say Patricia Newton is wrong about anything. But she was wrong about something tonight. She says, well, we're not sure that Dr. Finch will come back to Baltimore. Well, that was, I had never, that's true, I had never been to Baltimore. But then she took me to the Tremont Plaza Hotel, where I was ensconced in a suite. And I says, you keep treating me like this, and you're going to have to bring me back to Baltimore. I come to your sister city, 40 miles south, quite often. Some of you in the audience perhaps have seen me there. But this is really my first trip to Baltimore. I guess I shouldn't be dropping names, but your mayor was a year behind me at Yale, so I do know him. I don't know whether he'd want to claim me or not, but nonetheless. So, as I say, it is a pleasure. It is really a pleasure to be here at Johns Hopkins and in the Baltimore community. We're going to sort of perhaps open some windows, open some doors, hopefully, open some eyes, open some minds to a hidden reality, but a reality that is very much there nonetheless. Because one of the things that is happening, I think anybody who has been in this country anyway for the last 2 years knows that, in fact, there has been, shall we say, a tremendous amount of intensity around the issues of African-centered education, and in particular about that particular thought, those particular body of ideas that have undergirded what is known as African-centered education. And as you may know, there is a tremendous controversy about it. And in fact, there is a lot of nonsense spouted, really, I have to, in all honesty, on both sides of the issue. And one of the things we hope to do is begin to clarify, to at least partly anyway, or at least as far as we can, what are the real issues here. Because as Sheikh Anta Diop says, one of my mentors, it is only when we create a solid foundation of empirical fact can we create or can we proceed to build a body of humanistic science that will prepare the way for what he called the new African Renaissance. There are many ways in which we could go, and you will see that I will drink a lot of water while I'm up here, so please don't get too distracted by that. There are many ways we could go on this issue or in this topic or in this vein. I myself, as was intimated in the initial comments, have no fewer than 10 different subjects upon which I do presentations on in this general realm of Nile Valley studies, of reconstruction of African history, because there are so many things that have been hidden, camouflaged, buried, and outright denied, stolen, lost, and betrayed, that the work is immense. As I've said to a number of people on many different occasions, that if we had 1,000 full-time scholars working 250 years, we would not recover all of it, because there is literally that much to do. And day by day, year by year, information comes to light, facts come to light, realities come to light, truths come to light, which mean that in the next millennium, which is after all, but now only 8 years away, history will in a sense have to be rewritten from scratch. we will have to essentially rewrite the history books, because our whole perspective has had to change because of some compelling, undeniable realities that are surfaced, despite all of, shall we say, the intense and sometimes inflammatory give and take that sort of surrounds these discussions in the media and out of it. But what we're going to do actually is make this a visual sort of experience, because the adage that one picture is worth 1,000 words is still very true, still very evident. And there is nothing like the evidence of, there's nothing like illustrations, there's nothing like photos, there's nothing like the visual evidence to drive home the points that we wish to make as we go through this kind of odyssey that we are going to go through, because it is in some ways an odyssey. Now, what I would like to do is go ahead, without any further discussion, go right into the slides, and we will proceed from there, and they will accompany us as we go through a rather interesting sequence of really almost experiences dealing with the new light that is shedding on information that is coming to light every day. And I'm told all I have to do is push this white button, and yes. And most, if not all of you, of course, have seen this. If they haven't actually read the article, you have certainly seen Newsweek on the newsstands. And all I want to say about this is this. Was Cleopatra black? It is utterly and totally irrelevant whether she was or not. It has absolutely nothing to do with the issue. It is, as we say, a red herring. If there are any film buffs in the room, and I am a film buff, and I like Alfred Hitchcock movies, and Alfred Hitchcock had a device in his movies which he called a MacGuffin. And a MacGuffin is just his way of saying a red herring, focusing on something that had nothing to do with the issue and distracting your attention from what was really going on. Well, again, whether Cleopatra was black is, depending on your choice of words, either a MacGuffin or a red herring. But let's leave this rather petty controversy aside and move on to more important things. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, one of the things that I have to do, not only to first-time audiences, but really again and again and again, because I have to drive home with ample clarity this point, that when we are talking about the African background of medical science, or when we are talking about the African origins and contributions of science as a discipline, math, science, and medicine, we have to begin at the beginning of African civilized history. And that, of course, is beginning in the Nile Valley country that the Greeks named Egypt very late, but which they themselves called Cam or Kemet, meaning the Black Land. Now, of course, this is, after all, the heart or the crux of the issue, is it not? Who were these so-called Egyptians? And again, this has called for the reams of print, as I say, really that have led to nothing but red herrings. And we might quote the most unequivocal statement from antiquity by the so-called father of history, Herodotus, about this subject, because it is important to establish this beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond any reasonable doubt, before we can begin or enter into a discussion about where science and medicine and civilization in the African context begins. And this is Herodotus, as we said, who spent he lived 450 BC, nearly 2,500 years ago. He went to Egypt, spent 7 months there, traveled from north to south, east to west. He lived with the Egyptians, talked with them, interviewed them, broke bread with them. And what does he say about them? He says, and this is his statement, that like the Colchians and the Ethiopians, they are black-skinned, woolly-haired, and practice circumcision. As I say, the clearest, most unequivocal statement from antiquity about the race and ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians. You would be surprised at how many contortions subsequent scholars, antiquarians, classicists, and Egyptologists have turned themselves into in order to get around this rather inconvenient statement. Now, by itself, it would be an interesting statement, but people could, as they have done actually for about 150 years, ignore it. But it is real interesting that there are nearly 15 surviving references in the literature of ancient Greece about the race and ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians from individuals as diverse and eminent as Strabo, Aeschylus, Aristotle, Plutarch, etc., plenty, 15 of them, who in every respect corroborate the statement of Herodotus about the race and ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians. So as far as the Greeks were concerned, the people that we today call the ancient Egyptians, that is the pyramid builders, to a man, they were black and African. And by the way, this is, I think, a rather instructive anecdote. Some of you may have heard of Hansberry, William Leo Hansberry, who was a father of African studies, professor at Howard for many years, and he studied up at Harvard with Reisner back in the 1920s. And Reisner was pontificating about the ancient Egyptians and who they were and where they came from. And Hansberry had the temerity to raise his hand and say, well, what about the statement of Herodotus that the ancient Egyptians were black-skinned and woolly-haired people? To which Reisner, who was the dean of American Egyptologists at that time, says, well, I do not consider Herodotus an authority. Whereupon Hansberry says, well, he was there, you weren't. And perhaps this is one of the things that we can say where we are talking about surviving Greek references. They were there, they saw. They had no reason to say anything but to report the evidence of their two eyes. And particularly since it is a unanimous consensus, a unanimous statement, there's no reason to doubt them whatsoever. And yet, doubt has been cast on this very issue. Let us go forward. What we're going to do, and this is going to be a rather brief segment because we really want to get into the heart of our topic, is, if you will, do what I call an ethnographic survey of ancient Egypt, a pictorial ethnographic survey of ancient Egypt. So again, you have the proper images in mind when I talk about these people being black African people. Because even though you may, let's just say for argument, you may accept my intellectual statement of the issue, still in your mind, or the tendency in your mind is when you think ancient Egypt, you think Elizabeth Taylor or Charlton Heston. You think the Hollywood images of what these people look like. Now, these images are very powerful, even if intellectually you know better. So we have to, shall we say, provide substitute images which are, in fact, the correct images. And we see the Sphinx, the so-called Sphinx. And even though its nose has been blown off, we can look at its, shall we say, the physiognomy of the face of the Sphinx. And it is not too much of a stretch of imagination to know whoever was the model of the Sphinx, he had to have been what we today call a sub-Saharan African black person. And we see this is an ancient Egyptian woman from the early dynasties. Again, hair, coloring. Again, her ethnicity should, again, be rather obvious. This is Djoser, the pharaoh of the third dynasty, the pharaoh of Imhotep. When we are in the process of looking at iconography, that is, images and statues and figures, and we're trying to make a determination about the race and ethnicity of these various portraits and these images and these statues and these figures, we of course have to look at characteristics that denote what ethnic type we're talking about. Generally, these are fairly evident, which is to say, and by the way, I don't want to get into a discussion about whether there really is whether race is a real fact or not. Genetically, there is no race. That much is true, and I'm going to digress upon this in a second. But phenotypically, and I think this is mostly or largely a medical audience, so they know what I mean by phenotype. Those of you who are not in the medical field, phenotype is merely the sum total of your physical characteristics or outward or macro characteristics. Generally, race is a phenotypic marker of variation. That's all it is. But it allows us to say, in a general sense, that black people came from Africa, Caucasian people came from Europe, and people we call, whatever you like to call yellow, Mongoloid, Asiatic people, came from East Asia. So that when we are talking about the phenotype of people that we today say descend from Africa, there are certain general characteristics which are generally indicative. Of course, there is the lips, nose, flaring nostrils, thick lips. There's, of course, the texture of the hair, and, of course, the skin coloration, which can vary from a deep, dark black color all the way up to, all the way to a brown, coppery, yellowish color. all of these still indicative of black Africans. So that when we see an individual like this in profile, we don't have too much trouble indicating his ethnicity, his origin, his provenance. That is, his remote ancestors or even his near ancestors came out of Inner Africa. This is Joseph from the 3rd dynasty. This individual, not only in profile are his features characteristic, but even his coloration. Or this individual, Amenemhet III from the Middle Kingdom, represented in his true and natural coal black coloring. One of my favorite individuals from antiquity, this is Amos Nefertari, the founding ancestress of the 18th dynasty. She is the most celebrated individual in Egyptian antiquity by the Egyptians themselves. Again, here she is represented in her true and natural black coloring. Tutankhamun, some of you may have even seen Tutankhamun, and then when you saw him painted this way in his true and natural black coloring, you took the word of the guide who said the reason why he was painted this way is because it was, quote, symbolic. Generally, whenever you find ancient Egyptian statuary colored black or pictures colored black individuals, it's always, quote, symbolic, unquote. I'll let you sort of determine to what extent that insults your intelligence or not. This is Osiris. Now, Osiris is the most important deity of Egyptian antiquity through 4,000 years of its history. He is the literal prototype of the Christ figure, the God who became man, died, and was resurrected, and became the hope of resurrection for all mankind. Now, why am I projecting him up here like this? It's just to make a point. When people represent their gods or deities in anthropomorphic form, that is, in human form, they generally make them look like what they look like. Which is to say, on the Sistine Chapel, when you see the image of God stretching out his finger and touching Moses, that is a figure of Michelangelo's uncle, who was reputedly the model that Michelangelo used to make God. Well, that's perfectly appropriate. Just like in China or Japan, Buddha looks like Chinese and Japanese. Only point to make. People, when they anthropomorphically represent their gods and deities, they make them look like themselves. So, therefore, if you've got Osiris, and I will use this word because it is descriptive, and I use it with due apologies to Dr. Watkins, I will use this word for purely descriptive purposes only. This is a black Negro. So, the people who worship him, likewise, would have been black Negroes. So there's absolutely no ambiguity about what I'm talking about. Now, why do I make this point about making the point about him being a black Negro? Because there are those who say that there's such thing as black white people. So we don't even have to get into these kinds of mind games, these kinds of semantic twisting and turnings, so you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say, and you can see it. I don't even have to say it. You can see it. It's right there on the image. And so the people who created this God in their own image would have looked like him. If there's any lingering doubt, then maybe the ancient Egyptians can put the matter to rest. Because this is very interesting. This comes from the tomb of Ramesses III. This is a scene from the wall of his tomb, Ramesses III, showing the 4 major ethnic groups that the ancient Egyptians sort of had daily intercourse with. This is around 1200 BC or thereabouts. Now, on the far right, you see a Yamu from Western Asia, from what is now Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, etc., etc. Third from the left, or second from the right, is a Nubian, that is a Sudanese. Third from the right, or second from the left, is a Tenu, who occupied the coast of what is now Libya. And the far left-hand side is a Rametu. Now, the Rametu was the ancient Egyptians' name for themselves, which means basically humans. But what I want you to notice is that the Rametu, that is the Egyptian on the far left, and the Sudanese, who is two figures down from him, are exactly the same as it concerns phenotype. Not only as concerns phenotype, but even to details of dress. So here, if there's any lingering confusion about who the Egyptians thought they were, here they are letting you know in living color thought I'd kick this out. In living color, who they were and what they looked like and who they were related to. You know who they look like, where they came from, and who they were related to. Akhenaten. Again, we can see in this profile, his features are very characteristic. And there's two other things, by the way, I might note because they're going to become important later. There is two skull characteristics which tend to denote an African type. Now, any of the anatomists in the room or comparative anatomists will tell you that it's very difficult to determine race from skull type. Well, that's more or less true, except when you got two characteristics which come together in one skull. One is dolichocephaly, that is long-headedness, combined with subnasal prognathism, prominence of the lower jaw. When you got those two and some other things together, you're about 95 to 99.9% sure that you've got an African skull. Nonetheless, look at Akhenaten. Not only does he have the subnasal prognathism, not only does he have the flaring nostrils and the thick lips, he even has, even though he's got a crown on, he's got the dolichocephaly. There are those who say the reason why he looks like this is because he had a hormonal disease. These are his daughters. Again, notice the lips, nose, and in particular notice the peculiar configuration of the head, the hyperdolichocephaly, the extreme long-headedness, because you only see that in one other place in the world. I'll show you that. This is also a daughter of Akhenaten. Again, the hyperdolichocephaly is very, very marked, is it not? The one other place where you find that to this degree is among these kind of people in what is now Rwanda, that is East Africa. This is a Watutsi royal woman from East Africa of the last century. This is a group of them. Notice again the tendency toward dolichocephaly. Dolichocephaly, and as I say, combined with prognathism, when all you have is a skull and you don't have anything else, almost always denotes the African type. If you were to go to ancient Egypt or Kemet today, and you wanted to know who are the people there who most look like what the ancient Egyptians of old, that is, the ancient Egyptians BC, look like, you would have to go south, where you would find the people today called the Nubians. And this is a Nubian woman from around Aswan. These are the people who would be closest to what the ancient Egyptians look like 2,000 years ago and before. Or this rather striking-looking individual, a Danakil from the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia. Notice the coiffure, that is the ringlets around the hair. Notice the skin coloration. Notice the features. A rather remarkable-looking individual, again, indicative of what the ancient people of Cam or Egypt would have looked like 2,000 years ago and more. Now, I hope, therefore, now we have settled. We haven't settled. We have at least provided some basis for our assertion that when we were talking about the ancient civilization of Egypt, we are talking about, in every respect, a black African civilization, period, end of statement. And we don't have to get into, again, little semantic subtleties that today, which have sort of come into the argument, and you will see it into that Newsweek article, that, well, the ancient Egyptians were Africans, but they weren't blacks. It was an African civilization, but it wasn't a black civilization, and anyway, they wouldn't have known anything. They wouldn't have known anything about race anyway. Well, make of that what you will. Hopefully what we have done is at least establish some ground for our assertion, and we can proceed further without any further reference to it. Now, from 4 million years ago to 200,000 years ago, the history, or I should say the story, of the appearance, origin, emergence, and evolution of pre-human ancestors into the human type occurred exclusively in Africa. C.A. Arenberg, who was recently an anthropologist, says, in Africa alone, do you find evidence, an unbroken sequence of the various stages of human evolution from 4 million years ago to 200,000 years ago. So that, anthropologically speaking, Africa is the true Garden of Eden of the race. Now, if in fact And evidence points very strongly or very powerfully in that direction. 200,000 years ago, modern human beings appeared in Africa. That is, human beings who are the direct ancestors of all 5.5 billion people on this planet, including the several hundred people in this room. And if there were no significant migrations out of Africa until nearly 100,000 years later, and I would say that the oldest non-African human fossils, that is, Homo sapiens sapiens fossils, that is, anatomically modern man fossils, were found recently in Israel, going back about 95,000 years ago. Whereas the oldest modern human fossils found in Africa go back to 130 to 140,000 years ago. So that is, and that makes sense. After all, migrations out of Africa would have occurred or would have taken place through the Isthmus of Suez. And in fact, we know that Western Asia and Arabia are really geographic and geological extensions of Africa. It makes as much sense to call them Northeast Africa as it does to call them Western Asia or the Middle East from a geological and geographical point of view. You know, the Middle East is kind of an artifact, a geopolitical artifact. You could just as easily call them Northeast Africa, because geologically, that is exactly what it is. But without going into making any further geopolitical statements, it would make sense that if that is the corridor out of which human beings migrated out of Africa, you would find evidence, non-African evidence of early human beings there first before you found them anywhere else, and that is where you find them, at least where out of Africa is concerned. All this goes back to my point, is that for 100,000 years, the story of humanity, that is modern human beings, us, 5.5 billion of us, was an African story and an African story alone, as far as we can determine. Now, what is my point about this? What does this have to do with our subject? It's just this. One of the things that distinguished human beings, modern human beings, from their ancestors, their hominid, pre-human ancestors, was this instrument we call the brain, giving it powers, this new animal on the face of the earth, powers of analysis, discrimination, reflection, quantification, comparison, comparative analysis, which enabled it to produce its greatest product, which is culture. So that the first experiments in what we would call the development or elaboration of human culture would have also occurred in Africa. Which is to say, culture and its products as human beings is also African first before it is anything else. It only stands to reason, which is to say language, myth, symbol, religion, philosophy, science, technology would have begun in Africa before you would find it anywhere else, quite logically, because that's where human beings were. And they were there only for tens of thousands of years. Now, it should therefore come as no surprise that the first evidence of advanced human culture doesn't also indeed appears in Africa first. For example, we know as a matter of fact that 40,000 years ago in Swaziland, Africans were mining iron ore. We know as a matter of fact, 28,000 years ago, Africans in what is now Zambia were mining manganese. Not just digging them up, mining, actually having mining works. There is powerful evidence, almost to a certainty, that the domestication of animals, which was one of the other steps that led human beings to settled communities, occurred in Kenya about 18,000 years ago. The evidence is also very suggestive that 15,000 years ago, or 17,000 years ago, agriculture began also in the Nile Valley before it began anywhere else. The evidence for that is mainly that in certain sites in what is now northern Sudan and what is called upper or southern Egypt, there are areas where there was obviously human habitations with thousands upon thousands of grinding stones, sickles, and all of the instruments that you need for grinding grain. Now, some have tried to say, well, they could have been harvesting wild grain, except for one thing. The sheer numbers make that impossible. Wild grain cannot support more than a few people over a long period of time. This particular area was inhabited for year after year after year after year, and they had thousands upon thousands of grinding stones, meaning that they would have had to have been harvesting large quantities of grain, which in and itself suggests most powerfully, that they had invented agriculture 15, 16,000 years ago. And by the way, agriculture was probably a female invention, paving the way towards civilization. The most single important invention in the history of civilization, making civilization possible. Now, all that to say is that the proto-technology necessary for the eventual creation of high culture or civilization, again, we find it in sequence in Africa before we find it anywhere else. Now, it isn't just proto-technology we're talking about. We're even talking about intellectual culture. This is the Ashango bone, discovered in Zaire. It's about 10,000 years old. It demonstrates, for one thing, a counting and numerical system, a binary counting and numerical system, and it's also apparently a lunar calendar. So here we see, shall we say, the prototypes of science also making their appearance in Africa before they appear anywhere else in what is now Zaire. Oh, goodness, I'm afraid of this. This is the title page from the Rind Mathematical Papyrus. Unfortunately, it's on its side, so you almost have to turn over like that to see it. I apologize. Nonetheless, this early, shall we say, mathematical experiments or mathematical speculations give rise in the lower Nile Valley in what is now Egypt, or at that time ancient Egypt, 4,000 years ago, to mathematics as a coherent, cohesive discipline. Mathematics did not begin with the Greeks, even the Greeks say so. Geometry was an African invention. And Pythagoras admitted as much. And so did everybody who came after him. This is the Rind Mathematical Papyrus that is 4,000 years old. This is the title page. I'm just going to read you the translation of the title page. The entrance into the knowledge of all existing things and obscure secrets. Interesting title page for a mathematical treatise. We find in the Rind Mathematical Papyrus, we find formulas for the area of the rectangle, which is problem number 6. This is the Rind Mathematical Papyrus. There are, I think, 4 mathematical papyri that have been discovered. One is the Moscow Mathematical Papyrus, showing you the area of a rectangle, or the formula for obtaining the area of a rectangle, A equals L times B. This is problem number 14 of the Moscow Papyrus. This is the formula for finding the volume of a truncated pyramid. Now, the volume for a truncated pyramid gives you volume equals height, 1/3 the height, times a squared, ab plus b squared. This is actually more difficult than finding the volume of the total pyramid. So if they could, check on the job says, he who can do more can do less. So if they can find the volume of the truncated pyramid, they also knew the volume of the pyramid, how to find the volume of the pyramid. 1/3 the height times area squared. This is problem number 56, also from the Rind Mathematical Papyrus. This is a problem that allows them to demonstrate how to find the slope of the pyramid. And in this problem, they actually deal with cotangents, showing that they had also not only begun their studies in geometry, but also in trigonometry as well. Among these ancient people of the Nile, these ancient black peoples of the Nile, we find the first evidence of algebra, because in the Rind Mathematical Papyruses, number 24 to 27, are algebraic equations of the first degree. They also handled algebraic equations of the second degree. Algebra is basically, if you have to strip it down to its essentials, its ability to solve problems when you have an unknown. Now, we call that unknown usually X or Y. The ancient Kemites used to call it a quantity. But it's still solving problems by use of an unknown. Now, some people have tried to say that this mathematics was cookbook mathematics. It was recipe mathematics. It was practical. It showed no capacity for theoretical abstract mathematics. That the ancient Egyptians had no capacity for demonstrating logical and rigorous proofs. Let me quote you from the statement of a modern historian of mathematics about the nature of proof. 20th century students of the history of science incline to the modern attitude that an argument or logical proof must be, quote, symbolic if it is to be regarded as rigorous. And one or two specific examples using selected numbers cannot claim to be scientifically sound. But this is not true. A non-symbolic argument or proof can be quite rigorous when given for a particular value of the variable. It should be typical, and that further generalization to any value should be immediate. In the Rind mathematical papyrus, both these requirements are satisfied, so the arguments adduced by scribes are already rigorous. The concluding proofs are not really necessary, only confirmatory. The rigor is implicit in the method. This is problem 51 of the Rind mathematical papyrus, showing finding the area of a triangle. Basically, area equals 1/2 the base times the height. Problem number 50, which we don't have up here, the ancient Kemites were also able to find the area of a hemisphere, which is, in modern notation, area equals 2 times pi times r squared, which means that they could also find the area of a sphere, which is 4 pi r squared. They also, therefore, if they knew that much, they knew the area of the circle. And the area of the circle, as we know, is pi r squared. The Rind mathematical, our modern value for pi is 3.14128. The ancient Kemite value for pi was 3.1605. People have tried to say that the Babylonians had a higher level of mathematics than the ancient Egyptians, and yet the best that the Babylonians could come up with for a value of pi was 3. Now, the ancient Egyptians actually had what we could only describe as understanding arithmetic and geometrical progressions, which is to say that they knew, in order to find an arithmetical progression, that S, which is the sum of n terms, equals n over 2 times 2a, where a is the first and lowest term, plus n minus 1, plus d, where d is the common difference. They also understood geometrical progressions. We know it in the problem of the Hecat, where a geometrical term is the following, or a geometrical progression is this. To find the sum of the geometrical progression whose first term is 7 and whose common ratio is 7. Now, those of you who read Mother Goose lately will remember the Mother Goose rhyme, "As I was going to St. Ives." As I was going to St. Ives, I met a man with 7 wives. Each wife had 7 sacks. Each sack had 7 cats. Each cat had 7 kids. Kids, cats, sacks, wives. How many were going to St. Ives? This is a geometrical progression that you find in the Rind mathematical papyrus 4,000 years earlier. In the problem of the Hecat, instead of using wives, they said 7 houses. Each house had 7 cats. Each cat had 7 mice. And each mice had 7 spelt. And they went one further. They went to a 5th progression. Each spelt had 7 hecats. So they went to progression out to 16,807. So the idea, as Gilling says, that the ancient Kemites did not understand the theoretical applications of the mathematics that they invented is merely a conceit. It has nothing to do with the reality. So, I am fond of asking young black students is, why are you afraid of mathematics? Why do you run away from mathematics and physics? Africa invented mathematics and physics. That isn't my opinion, that just happens to be the reality. I didn't make it happen. That just happens to be the way it is. And the Greeks themselves say so, not once, not twice, but at least a dozen times. All the Greek mathematicians studied in Egypt. Eudoxus, Archimedes, Hipparchus, Pythagoras, Thales, Plato. In fact, the Greeks were in a habit, if they didn't study in Egypt, they would say they would in order to give themselves credibility. The Great Pyramid. We're only going to say a little bit about the Great Pyramid. Certainly the grandest edifice of its kind ever created by the hand of man. I just want to point out two things about the Great Pyramid. 483 feet in height. The base of the pyramid is 13 acres in area. It was built out of 2.7 million blocks of stone. The lightest stone was 1 ton. The heaviest was 7 tons. Planed to such a smoothness that when they were fitted together, if you plucked a hair out of your head, you could not fit it between the joints. Oriented precisely to the 4 cardinal points. The descending passage was built at 3 degrees 43 minutes in slope. Oriented exactly to Alpha Draconis, which shone down at 3340 BC, 3340 BC, and it won't shine it down it again until 26,000 years later. The height of the pyramid, if you multiply it by 1 billion, gives you the mean distance between Earth and Sun. People say that's a coincidence. Well, as has been said, a coincidence is merely something that happens that you can't explain, that you haven't determined what the cause and effect is. Very strange coincidence. This was built. Do you know that the Japanese tried to build a scale model of the pyramid 1/10 its size 4 or 5 years ago using the same methods? Their boat sank, their rocks cracked, their cranes crumbled under the pressure, and they stopped after about 6 months. I've got to tone myself down a little bit so we can get through this. Because they said it was impossible. So how did these ancient Kemites, these ancient black people who are supposed to have, as was said, created nothing, discovered nothing, invented nothing, explored nothing, how did they do it? Mystery. No, it's really my fault. Something going on up there? I don't even know where I am, so I have to see the slide because that gives me my clue. It may not have fallen down. I think that's what's happened. I think the slide didn't fall down or something. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to push this again and wait for, okay, good. This is the interior of the Grand Gallery, showing how it would have been used to measure the time of movement of the stars across this particular area. And it would have therefore given them some way of measuring the minute of arc. The Great Pyramid, I can't speak for the other pyramid, was not just a pile of rock created to the vanity of a certain pharaoh, as sort of our romantic notions of, you've seen the Hollywood movies, 100,000, 500,000 slaves building this rock just because a pharaoh wanted a big mountain to lie under. We've already kind of seen that doesn't make sense. And in fact, whatever the Great Pyramid was, it was not a tomb in any conventional sense of the word. What is very interesting else about it is that right at the equinox, the sun at noon climbs up over the apex of the pyramid, and the pyramid, as they say, swallows its shadow. It loses its shadow. That only happens one time a year, and when that happens, they're able to determine the exact day of the equinox. Next slide, please. This was found. This was found nearly 2,400 years ago in Alexandria, in Egypt. People for a long time, it's dated that time. It was found 100 years ago. People thought it was a bird for a long time until a NASA engineer says, well, look, no bird has that kind of a body. No bird has reverse dihedral wings, and what you can't see is no bird has a vertical tail. He says what this was 2,400 years ago is a glider, an aerodynamically sound glider. Now, don't come out of here and say Dr. Finch says that the Egyptians invented powered flight, that they beat the Wright brothers by 2,400 years. And I'm not saying that, but they were experimenting with aeronautics 2,400 years ago. As I am fond of saying, to quote Solomon, there's nothing new under the sun, or the Finch corollary is, the only thing that's new is that which has been forgotten. Didn't just happen in ancient Egypt, even after Egypt had left the historical scene. This is a iron smelter from Tanzania going back 2,000 years, able to achieve temperatures of over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures not possible in Europe even 100 years ago, or 120 years ago. In fact, East Africa was known for the quality of its iron and steel. It was called wood steel because the Indians, that is from the continent of India, used to import the steel to make their famous Damascus swords. Damascus swords weren't actually from Damascus. So we see that either technological prowess was evident in Africa outside of Egypt as well. Now, let me see. I think I got another slide here on this. Yes. I think they stopped doing this about 500 years ago, but they preserved it in their oral traditions. In other words, how to build one of these smelters, which is built out of termite mud. They use termite mud because it's impermeable to water. Now, it's very interesting. During World War II, of course, there was no commerce back and forth to Africa, so Africa went into an acute iron shortage and steel shortage because they'd been getting it from Europe. Well, from their oral traditions alone, they reconstructed the smelter and then proceeded to produce their own iron and steel. The famous Dogon of Mali, a so-called Neolithic people, supposedly without intellectual culture, and yet they were able to describe the star Sirius, the brightest star in the heavens outside of the solar system, in the southern heaven. They not only described Sirius, but they described, and had been describing for 700 years, a small companion star, which is a white dwarf, which is called Sirius B, first discovered in Europe in 1862. Not only did they know that Sirius B was a near invisible white dwarf, and therefore that it was heavy, but they knew its periodicity around Sirius A, which is 50 years. They even say that there is another star orbiting around Sirius, but that we know is there, but we haven't found it yet. Now, these are people supposedly without telescopes, without technology. In fact, an MIT professor looked at this information and said, these people had no business knowing any of this. In so-called darkest Africa, a people who invented nothing, created nothing, explored nothing, and yet they have an astronomical knowledge that had only been achieved in Europe in the last century, at least as it concerns the Sirius star system. They also describe, by the way, the 4 moons around Jupiter, the Saturn's rings. They describe the Milky Way and the spiral galaxy that spin at incredible speed away from the center of the universe. This is a diagram of the Dogon version of the orbit of Sirius B around Sirius A, and that's a modern astronomical diagram on the right. And this is what they call a linear extension model on the left, based on the African model of path of Sirius A and Sirius B, and the right is a modern astronomical diagram, which is absolutely the same all the way out to 1990. What is fascinating to me about the Dogon, among the many things that fascinate me about them, is they have 4 calendars. A calendar based on the sun, the moon, Sirius, and a 4th one based on the cycles of Venus. You see, people take calendars for granted. We think calendars are something to tell you the months of the year, the days of the week, the season you're in, and you don't understand that the calendar was probably the first great intellectual achievement of mankind, or humankind, because in order to invent a precise and accurate calendar, you have to know the precise movements and predict the precise movements of whatever heavenly body is the basis of your calendar, whether it be sun, moon, or stars. So that means a long period of astronomical observation, accurate observation, preserving the record of your observations, and being able to predict your celestial movements. It looks as if that the ancient Kemites, and by the way, the Dogon too, also had a calendar based on a 26,000-year cycle we call the precession of the equinox. Okay, this is Johns Hopkins Medical School. I'm a physician. There are a lot of physicians in the room. Let's get down to the pièce de résistance, one of my favorite subjects, the African background of medical science. This book has 3 essays on the subject. There are a total of 8 essays. 3 of them are on this subject. And why don't we get to it without any further ado or delay? This is a hieroglyphic sign, Sunu or Swenwe, which means in the ancient Kemite language, the physician. Now, this is the god Thoth, or Tehuti in ancient Kemite. He is a god of mind, will, and intelligence. He's the mind of science and learning, and he is the god of medicine, the first such god of medicine, 2,000 to 4,000 years before Hermes. Hermes, the Greek god of medicine, is, in fact, a later Greek version of Thoth. And those physicians and people who work in the health-related fields in the room know that the modern symbol of medicine certainly throughout all the Western world, and somewhere you can find it somewhere here in Johns Hopkins University, of course, is the so-called caduceus, the staff with a snake twined around it. And we say that comes from Hermes. There it is, 2,000 years before Hermes. And so our modern symbol of medicine is an ancient African symbol that has come down unbroken over a period of 4,000 to 6,000 years. The only thing is new is that which has been forgotten. Can I have the next one? Hippocrates. As I like to say, I have not come to bury Hippocrates, but to praise him. Whatever he was, however, he was not the father of medicine. He would never have had the temerity or the audacity to call himself the father of medicine. He has had, however, a profound influence over medicine over the last 2,500 years, and you would think that somebody with that much influence and that much who sort of is part of not only the history but really the folklore of modern medicine would be a clear-cut historical person. But perhaps folklore is suggestive because we don't know very much about him. When you look closely at him, he kind of recedes into the mist like a ghost. We only know 3 things about him. He was born on the island of Kos in eastern Aegean. He was a descendant from a line of Asclepian priests. Asclepios, it was the Greek god of medicine. And he was, there is no reason to doubt, a physician of unusual and outstanding gifts. No reason to doubt that whatsoever. He was so great as a physician that a school grew up around him. However, he did not even write a fraction of the so-called Hippocratic written corpus. He did not even compose the Hippocratic Oath. And if anyone had put to him or asked him who is the father of medicine, he would have echoed his countryman Homer, who 500 years earlier said that in medicine, Egypt leaves the rest of the world behind. So I only want to put Hippocrates in the proper historical perspective. That is all. If there is such thing as a father of medicine, it is this man or it is no one, Imhotep. Even though he lived 3,000 years before Hippocrates, we actually know more about him than we know about Hippocrates. We knew who his parents were. We knew where he was born, where he was raised, what he did. He was, as Sir William Osler, and this was Osler's institution right here. Osler practically founded this institution, did he not? Osler said of Imhotep, and by the way, Osler himself was, I've read some books by Osler. Osler was no joke. He was real. He was a real Renaissance physician, one of the last in this country anyway. And what does he say about what does he say about Imhotep? The first figure of a physician to stand out clearly from the mists of antiquity. Or as I like to call him, the first universal genius of whom we have any knowledge. He was prime minister under Djoser, so therefore a statesman. He was renowned as a philosopher and a purveyor of oral wisdom. He was an architect of genius, having designed and built the step pyramid of Saqqara, but above all, he was a divinely gifted physician. So great was his renown as a physician that by the 6th century BC, he became deified as a physician and worshipped by the Greeks, including Hippocrates, because Asclepios was identified with Imhotep. So when you worship Asclepios, you would worship Imhotep. So in the Hippocratic Oath, when the physician says, I swear by the god Apollo and I swear by the god Imhotep, I swear by Asclepios, he is in fact swearing by Imhotep. Those of you who have been to ancient Cam have seen the Saqqara complex designed and built by Imhotep. If he had done nothing else in the world but designed and built this temple complex, his fame would be indelible and assured. But beyond that, he was even more renowned as a physician. I'm sorry Dr. Watkins had to leave, because if he didn't already know it, and he already might, it is in ancient Cam, 6,000 years ago, that the first systematic studies of cardiovascular circulation and cardiovascular physiology began. There is something called the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, about 6,000 years old, which I call the founding document of scientific medicine, in which are described the heart as the center of the circulatory system, the major vessels going out of the heart and into the periphery and into the vital organs, the movement of blood out of the heart, the phenomenon of pulsation that occurs as a result of the movement of blood outside the heart, the measuring of the pulse itself, which Hippocrates, by the way, did not do, the understanding a relationship between the heart and the lung, heart and the kidneys, and even the heart and the liver. The physicians in the room know what I mean when I talk about passive congestion of the liver as a result of congestive heart failure. Ancient Egyptians described that. They described angina pectoris. They even described Stokes-Adams attacks. What is a Stokes-Adams attack? Some people can get heart dysrhythmias. Those dysrhythmias cause a slowing down of blood to the brain, and the person can pass out. Simply put, the ancient Egyptians describe that not only in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, but in the Ebers Papyrus. So that cardiovascular physiology and cardiovascular pathology and cardiovascular medicine begins in Africa 6,000 years ago. And I think Johns Hopkins is one of the world's centers of cardiovascular medicine, if I'm not mistaken. Don't even know. They owe a debt to ancient black people living on the Nile 6,000 years ago. Oh, by the way, that is a modern drawing. You won't find that was a modern person writing about the ancient Egyptian medicine, and he was just showing you in pictorial terms what their descriptions of the cardiovascular system would have ramified into. This is a clepsydra or water clock. In smaller versions, there are those who think it would have been used to measure the pulse, because the ancient Egyptians very clearly did measure the pulse. What we said about cardiovascular physiology also applies to anatomy. It is in ancient Egypt, 6,000 years ago, that you had the first systematic studies of anatomy, the first anatomy textbooks, the first anatomy anatomical lexicon. This is the skull, the external skull, and all the topographical landmarks of the skull are demarcated in a technical language. This is one of the things that is fascinating about the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus. It is the first technical and scientific language in the world. This is the interior portion of the cranium, which was described by the ancient Kemites. I might just mention that they described the results of what happens to injuries to the temporal portion of the brain. The physicians in the room know that in the front part of the temporal portion of the brain is Broca's area, controlling articulate speech. Behind Broca is Wernicke's area, controlling processing and understanding of sounds and language. You get a lesion or an injury to the Broca's area, you get expressive aphasia. To Wernicke's area is receptive aphasia. Expressive aphasia means you slur your words. Receptive aphasia means that you can't understand what's being said to you, so you speak in meaningless babble. With the ancient Egyptian, and by the way, an injury to both, you can get injury to both, which is total or mixed aphasia. The ancient Egyptians describing this in the Edmund Smith papyrus. So they have not only described the sort of macro surface of the brain, they had described the cortical functions of certain areas of the brain nearly 4,000 years before Broca's experiments 120 years ago, 130 years ago. Next slide. This is just the visceral anatomy. Next slide, please. From Edwin Smith's surgical papyrus, what we call the postcranial skeleton. Next slide. This is case number 31 in the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, a vertebral dislocation. What is absolutely amazing about this is that the ancient Kemites describe the neurological, in medicine we say sequela, side effects or effects of this particular type of injury or insult, including paraplegia, quadriplegia, priapism, genital urinary incontinence, what they call missioseminus, the inability to control the secretion of semen. All this is described in the Edmund Smith surgical papyrus. Now you have to understand, about 50 years ago, not even that long ago, about 30 years ago, a physician was looking at all this and he was saying, you know, today, as we speak, it would be difficult. See, one of the things you have to appreciate as a physician, that here they're able to relate a specific insult or injury or problem to a complex series of pathological outcomes. Now, this caused one physician to comment. He said, it would be difficult for us to make all these connections and correlations today without benefit of x-rays. So the question arises, how did our black African priest physicians of 6,000 years ago do so? Trepanation, a forerunner of neurosurgery, not practiced only in Africa. They practiced in, by the way, Europe, Asia, and South America. But it was also practiced among the ancient Egyptians in the Nile Valley. It was just a method by which an instrument was taken to bore through the skull into the brain to relieve intracranial pressure or to remove bone fragments from a fracture. We know that individuals survived this procedure because of the smooth margins and because of the grainy appearance around the area, around the wound, showing that there was healing. By the way, I've just finished a paper on trepanation. So-called pre-modern trepanation in places like Africa, Asia, South America had, and this goes back 5,000 years ago, had healing rates or survival rates of 80%. In 1900, in a hospital in London, the fatality rate for an exact same operation was 75%. We say, okay, Dr. Finch, this is all right, but this is all primitive, right? We don't do these things anymore. We don't have to because we got much better methods to take care of this problem. Well, that would be a good assumption, but you would be wrong, because our erstwhile president, rather over 2 years ago, underwent the exact same operation to relieve intracranial pressure. We'll come back to this a little while later. They were well known as bone setters, the forerunner of orthopedic surgery. Here we see them. This is the ancient Kemites, the ancient Egyptians, reducing a dislocated shoulder. This is the materials they used to set long bone fractures. We're going through this rapidly in the interest of time. Gaping wounds were stitched. This is actually a mummy, and you see what we would do in medicine called a running stitch, but it's evident that they would have used the same kind of suture for a living person as well. For those of you who have been to ancient Egypt, or been to Egypt, excuse me, you may have been to Komombo. This is on This is in the back part of that temple complex. And these are ancient Egyptian surgical instruments: knives, forceps, scalpels, scissors, probes, etc. This is an ancient Egyptian ophthalmological kit, or ophthalmological surgery instruments. Now, we know as a matter of absolute fact that 500 years ago and earlier, physicians in Mali were successfully performing cataract removal. One of the reasons, what is interesting is that in the last century, traditional physicians in southeastern Africa were also successfully removing cataracts from the eyes. Now, I surmise, and I have to say it is a surmise, that the ancient Egyptian surgeons probably performed cataract surgery as well. Can't go to court on it because we don't have any direct evidence, but I would just offer it to you as an opinion, and perhaps this instrument, these collection of instruments may have been used in cataract surgery. We know it was done elsewhere in Africa. It's not unlikely that it was also done back then in ancient Egypt. Next slide, please. This is a medicine bottle. Up there you see the left eye of Horus, which is the moon. The moon was, by all traditional peoples in Africa and elsewhere, and the ancient Egyptians, the moon was considered to, shall we say, influence or control medicinal plants. We have found out recently that, yes, the biochemical constituents of many plants changes according to phases of the moon. Traditional peoples apparently understood this. Nonetheless, the moon, and therefore the left eye of Horus, became the symbol of medicinal plants, the celestial symbol of medicinal plants. I want you to remember that, and I want you to take a gander of that. Those physicians who've got their prescription pads handy, take a look at your prescription pads. If not, go to your drugstore and you will see the RX symbol. This is the prototype of the RX symbol. What I'm showing here is actually the eyeshadow, actually the eyeliner. Many people thought this was cosmetic, this black eyeliner, but you have to understand, Egypt was subject to yearly floods, and that made them susceptible to eye diseases because of vermin and bacteria, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were subjected to eye diseases, particularly during the summer, during the high point of the flood. Come to find out that this black eyeliner was made out of, among its constituents is copper malachite. Not copper malachite, it's copper pigmentation. It's not, yeah, it is malachite, it is malachite, copper malachite. Which itself, as you can see on the agar plate at the bottom, you can see the zone of inhibition, that dark area. That means it has an inhibitory or static effect on certain bacteria. So it is now assumed that that black eyeliner that the ancient Egyptians used to put on their eyes was a prophylactic against eye disease. And here it's even more striking in this particular agar plate with the copper in the middle and the rather clearly demarcated zone of inhibition around it. Myrrh was used in many Egyptian medicinal preparations. And I always wondered, when I was, every Christmas time, why the three wise men always brought Jesus gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, myrrh is a bitter aromatic substance found, you could only get it from two places, Somalia, Ethiopia, and what is now Yemen. But it was used as a medicinal component, and now we see why. Again, it has bacteriostatic or inhibitory effects on Staph aureus and Bacillus subtilis. So it was literally worth its weight in gold as a medicine. The ancient Egyptians used to use a preparation made out of basically grease and honey, 2/3 grease, 1/3 honey, as a wound salve. And here we see the very same compound tested, and we see its effect on staphylococci, one of the most important skin flora, okay, which is implicated in many, particularly post-surgical wounds and burn wounds. Even more striking for E. coli. And you might, I hope I got this slide, you might say, well, Dr. Finch, we got better. Sorry. I lost my punchline because I didn't have the right slide in there. Well, actually, maybe not. I want you to pay attention to this picture there. That is actually a physician applying a leech. A leech was used to draw out sera, blood, any fluid accumulation underneath the skin. That was practiced all the way up into the last century. In fact, physicians used to be called, with no sense of irony or pejorativeness about it, leeches, because leeches were used, again, to withdraw blood and for phlebotomy. Well, we see that the practice of using leeches to withdraw, blood and serum out of the skin goes back deep into antiquity. This goes back, 3,600 years nearly. And you will find, number one, and I really should have put this before because my punchline would have been better, that the business of using salve and honey is not so primitive after all, because we find that surgeons are finding that there's no better preparation to be used in the treatment of not only surgical wounds, but decubitus wounds, decubitus ulcers that you find particularly in bedridden patients. You see the graph on the lower left-hand side shows you that there's actually a shortening of wound treatment. So some surgeons will use sugar in it, some will use honey, some will add betadine in it, but it's essentially the same preparation. Now, I want to, we saw that last slide about the leeches, and we say, okay, you say, again, Dr. Finch, that's all well and good, but that's very primitive. We don't need that anymore. Well, let's see, I was going to take this. I don't think I can do that. Let's just see if my voice is here. And it's in particular relevant to this city. Until a century ago, doctors applied leeches for almost every illness in the mistaken belief that they could draw out black bad blood. Today, leeches are used after microsurgery to reattach fingers, toes, and other bodily parts. An operation can fail because tiny blood vessels become clogged. But when a small leech is attached, it sucks out an altitude of blood from the clogged vessels. The leech's saliva contains an anticoagulant and an antiseptic. Maggots, fly larvae, once were allowed to clean festering battle wounds, have been used to save the legs of a 17-year-old girl who developed a blood infection that caused clotting in her leg. Oral antibiotics did not reach the source, so physicians at Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C. applied 1,500 maggots. They ate away dead skin while allowing healthy skin to survive. Now, what does this have to do with Baltimore? Well, about 5 years ago, my brother was doing an infectious disease fellowship at the University of Maryland, the medical school here in Baltimore. He says he actually saw this done here in Baltimore at University of Maryland. It was in the ICU, same situation. He says the ICU nurses hated it because those larvae, they turn into flies very readily. And so you got 1,500 flies flying around in an ICU. You can imagine what the infection control nurse thinks about that. Oh, one of my very, very favorite slides. Let's see, if there are any pharmacologists, pharmacists, or infectious disease specialists in the room, could you please raise your hand? No? Okay. You would really get a kick out of this, but anybody, everyone could get a kick out of it, but particularly in those areas, I think they would really get a kick out of this. This is bone slivers that have been put under a microscope, and the physicians in the room and the people in the medical sciences in the room know that bone, particularly actively mineralizing bone, takes up tetracycline very rapidly and very readily. This is the reason why, if you want to ensure that you're going to get sued by an irate parent, give that parent's child who's under 10 some tetracycline so it stains his teeth. The point is, you don't give children under 10 or 12 tetracycline because it gets taken up and stains teeth. This is a bone that fluoresces in the manner absolutely characteristic of, and mark this, therapeutic tetracycline. Okay, what does this, Dr. Finch, what does this have to do with anything? Well, that bone sliver that you see up there is 1,500 years old, and it comes from the Sudan. Now, okay, what is the mystery? No mystery. Like most antibiotics, tetracycline ultimately derives from a fungus called Streptomycetes, or Streptomyces. It grows naturally in the soils of Upper Egypt and the northern Sudan. The people who were exhumed to give these bone specimens were people who lived along the Nile in the northern Sudan and were intensive agriculturalists who would have stored their grains, and in these stored grains you would have had the growth of the fungus Streptomycetes, which is already in the environment. So what did they do? Well, let me enrich the brew here. There were 15 individuals exhumed from this particular site. One of the things that happens when you get chronic infection or untreated infection is that around the bone you get something called periostitis. In none of these 15 individuals was there periostitis who had this fluorescing bone pattern. So they seem to be remarkably free, as the author of this article said, from infectious disease. Now, two things had to happen. Either they inadvertently and accidentally ate this mold, or they therapeutically took the mold and used it to treat infectious disease. Now you have to understand, few people eat moldy grain. If they eat grain at all, what they do, they cook it, they grind it, they mill it, they refine it, and they make bread out of it. And in any case, if they eat moldy grain, they're not going to eat enough of it to give you this therapeutic picture of tetracycline. So these people, 1,500 years ago, were taking these molds and using them as tetracycline as an antibiotic. The only thing is new is that which has been forgotten. No, Alexander Fleming did not invent antibiotic therapy. Don't believe me, the evidence is right there on the screen. Don't argue with me, argue with the author. This is Cleopatra showing her in travail, that is labor. Show this because the ancient Egyptian women, when they wanted to determine, we don't have that much longer to go, we'll be finished in about 10 minutes here. Ancient Egyptian women, if they wanted to find out whether they were pregnant or not, used to bring a sample of their urine to a midwife or to the priest, who whereupon would take that urine and go out into his garden or her garden and sprinkle it all over their plants. They would watch the plants for a week. If the plants shot up, they would be able to say, yes, you are pregnant. Well, this was actually tried in the laboratory, and it was found out that, yes, the urine of pregnant women does have an accelerating growth on plants, certain plants anyway. Now, this was fast, and then I had a corroboration about this from an entirely unexpected source. I think about 6 to 8 months ago, a gentleman from Nigeria came and said, well, now I understand something. He says, in my country, when we want the cola nuts to grow fast, we sprinkle the urine of women on it, particularly pregnant women. So here, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, we find these people had, in effect, a rabbit pregnancy test. Elsewhere in Africa, medicine and medical science and contribution to medicine didn't just cease when Egypt left the historical scene, not by a long shot. These are masks, I'm not exactly sure what country they're from, showing you the ravages of smallpox. And we think, yes, we modern people, we saved Africa and the rest of the third world from smallpox. Well, up until about 300 or 400 years ago, they were doing a very good job of saving themselves, because they used to practice smallpox vaccination or inoculation 1,000 years before Jenner. And you know what I'm told? When you get your shots, you give your children your shots, the 17 or now 18 vaccine preventable disease, what are you giving to those children? You're giving them virus, either killed or attenuated virus. I'm told by a person from Africa said that's essentially they used to do the same thing. They used to strain the virus, they used to heat the virus, they actually used to attenuate the virus. When I say the virus, they used to get samples, pustule samples from someone who was affected by smallpox, and then inoculated with a pinprick into unaffected individuals. But apparently, in some cultures, they used to actually do something to the virus to actually weaken its effect. So it wouldn't give you the disease, it would only give you the immune response. So here we have a people in so-called darkest Africa understanding the concepts of contagion, immunity, and vaccination. Hundreds of years before they became operative scientific concepts in European medicine with Pasteur and Koch. If anything, elsewhere in Africa, trepanation underwent greater development than you even saw in ancient Egypt, particularly among the people we call the Kisi of western Kenya. These are the various methods used to trephine skulls. Trepanation is just the word meaning to open up the skull. These are the instruments used, and you see a skull that underwent trepanation in Kenya. This is a man in 1958 who underwent the procedure, on the left and the right. This gentleman lost nearly 40% of his skull in successive operations, but was still alive and kicking. Now, let me tell you, there are several indications for trepanation. Usually, skull trauma, getting hit in the head, increase in intracranial pressure, sometimes even epilepsy and psychosis. But the individual who had done these trepanations we've just seen did 100 of them, more than 100 of them, without one single fatality. Back in 1957, 1958, two men, Grounds and Margetts, collected information about trepanation in Kenya. Grounds said there were over that 2-year period, there were still 1,000 trepanations being done with fewer than 6 fatalities. Less than 1%, 0.6% fatality. And we already mentioned the fact that in 1900 in London, they were getting for the exact same kind of operation, getting mortalities of 75%. These are various kinds of surgery practiced in traditional Africa, particularly in East Africa. We won't dwell too long. These are various East African surgical instruments. In particular, I want you to pay attention to the implement on the right, the burning iron, the cautery iron, because it becomes important right about now. As I say, my pièce de résistance, my crowning glory. I won't say mine, but since I'm presenting it, I call it mine. Because if there's if someone said, Dr. Finch, show one slide to make your entire point, it would be this one, of all the ones that I've shown. R.W. Falcon, a medical missionary traveling in Uganda in 1879, interested in traditional obstetrics, came upon this scene in a village in the Banyoro Kingdom of Uganda and was allowed to witness it. Woman, 20 years old, first pregnancy, in labor 3 days without progress. 3 men, one holding her abdomen, the other holding her stomach, and the other, as you see the surgeon, poised with a knife. Mutters an incantation, takes banana wine, alcohol, washes his hands with it, washes the abdomen with it, then proceeds to cut her from the xiphoid process down to the pubis symphysis in what today is called a classical incision. Takes the cautery irons one by one, sealing off the bleeding points, opens up the peritoneum, opens up the uterus, takes out the baby, cuts the cord, clamps it, hands the infant to an assistant, then seals off the bleeding points again with the cautery iron that I showed you, turns the woman over on her side so the amniotic fluid would spill out, turns her back on her back, takes his fingers and goes inside the uterus and dilates the cervix from within. Now, the obstetricians and gynecologists in the room know what the significance of that is. You have to do that in order to let postpartum blood escape. Again, sealing off the bleeding points with red-hot cautery irons, then closing the uterus and the abdomen with 7 sharp spikes. Falcon observed mother and child for 11 days. The mother had 2 days of fever, which disappeared, and after 11 days, mother and child were alive and well. An elective cesarean section like this, elective, was not even done routinely in Europe until 20 years later. As Falcon himself said, Lister, the so-called founder of modern antiseptic surgery, his team could hardly have performed with greater smoothness. Falcon's informants say this was custom among their peoples, that when a woman could not push a baby out, they would hand her over to the surgeon. This has been going on for generations. This was no fluke. In fact, Falcon says you couldn't get this level of coordination and professionalism and surgical skill without a tried and true operation that had been going on for a long time. The surgeon obviously understood the concepts of anesthesia, antisepsis. He used wine, that is alcohol, to clean the surface and his hands, and hemorrhage control. Now, the anesthesia is the most confusing part, because the only thing that they will say is that Falcon noticed, I should say, is that she was given a concoction of banana wine. But the only time she made a noise is when the surgeon introduced the knife at the beginning. She made a little noise in her throat, and then for the rest of the operation, she did not utter a sound, even though she was awake. So there was something else in that concoction than just grog. I don't even rule out the possibility there may have been, shall we say, psychogenic or hypnotic factors involved. You know, the neurologist in the room and the psychiatrist in the room, people like Pat Newton and others know about endorphins, et cetera, et cetera. These are the biochemical substances within the body, created by the body, that cause anesthesia, that are released by things such as acupuncture. I'm speculating a little bit here, but I mean, I think all of this is a worthy speculation. The point is that this is a landmark, not merely in African surgery, this is a landmark in surgery, in a place at that time which was being called Darkest Africa. Had surgical technique that Europe had not, or America had not even achieved up to that time. You can see why, if I have to use one slide out of the 180 slides I have on African medicine, I would choose this one and this one alone. This is an artist's conception of what the woman looked like afterwards with the 7 sharp spikes. And that knife is the actual knife used in the operation. It is now in the Burroughs Wellcome Museum in London. This is just from Nigeria. This is like a birthing center, if you will, a traditional birthing center. We could do an hour and a half just on traditional African obstetrics, but one of the things I can tell you is that no one ever in Africa gives birth in what I call the anti-gravity position, or better known in medical circles as dorsal lithotomy, which to me, dorsal lithotomy, which to me means that it is convenient to the obstetrician, is not necessarily the best way of delivering a baby. But don't want to get on my soapbox about that. Nonetheless, in Africa, and that goes back in ancient Egypt, they always either sit, stand, or kneel when they deliver. This is just a sculpture again showing a woman in the process of delivering or in the process of labor. I had to throw a couple of these slides in at the end because I forgot to put them in sequence. I just wanted to show them. This is UT, court physician from the time of Ramesses. Significant because of this particular scene on his tomb showing his assistants making his medicinal concoctions, etc. This is one of my favorites, Peseshet, an eminent lady from antiquity who herself was a trained physician, not merely a trained physician, but became chief of physicians. Someone once said, well, Dr. Finch, if you say Imhotep is the father of medicine, Peseshet should be the mother of medicine. Well, I say I can't really argue with that, so let it be. This is a artist's conception of a Per Ankh based on the Temple of Edfu. Per Ankh, called the House of Life, was essentially not only a temple, but in effect a hospital and medical school for the training of the priest physicians. Okay, just showing you the endless resourcefulness of traditional physicians in many instances. This is a traditional gentleman who basically had his wrist lacerated. Now in Africa, there are these huge, large, voracious ants with these very powerful jaws. Once they clamp on anything, you can never get their jaws open. So this man had lacerated his wrist, the operator got 3 of these ants, one by one, set them on the cut. They would bite down around the cut, and one by one they would close it, and then they just cut the head off, leaving the heads in place as the clamps. Okay, I think that's it as far as the slides go. Let me just say this. I've seen this lecture, James Woods, some other people I recognize, and I was going to show them something they hadn't seen before. I just got some new slides, and what happened? I didn't pack it away, so I mea culpa, maxima culpa. We spent, an hour and a half or so on this subject. Every September, my friend at the Morehouse School of Medicine, Mwalimu Mara, who is director of the Human Values in Medicine, has me come talk to the second year students at Morehouse School of Medicine on everything I can tell them about the history of blacks in medicine. We spend 7 hours on this subject. So we have only just scratched the surface on a subject which is getting more, for me, the information is expanding by the year. Might interest you to know that in August I was awarded by USAID in Senegal a $240,000 grant to do a survey of a group of organized traditional healers, 383 of them, in a place called Fatick, which is 90 miles south of Dakar. The survey is now in progress. It began officially in December, and we're making tremendous progress. In fact, I was there for 5 weeks in October and November. I'm going back next Saturday for 3 weeks. I am the principal investigator. This is the first of its kind ever done, at least standing by itself. That was, and when I say standing by itself, funded for the sole purpose of doing a survey among these individuals, of which there are 383 of them. And the instrument itself has nearly 300 questions. And we think once this data is collected and analyzed, it's going to give us some information that we just never have had before. So all I'm saying is that the work continues. And I would just want to leave you just with a couple of thoughts, and that is just this. You know, we haven't even gotten into, shall we say, what I can only call the psychodynamic, ritualistic, and spiritual dimensions of medicine. We haven't even gotten into that. That itself is 4, 5, 6 hours. Maybe that's really a lifetime. I'm not trying to say that isn't important, but that requires a separate discussion in a way, because it requires a lot, well, it just requires a separate discussion. But as far as clinical medicine, scientific medicine is concerned, as a discipline, it begins in Africa. And it begins in Africa in the Nile Valley civilization that we call Egypt. Even after Egypt leaves the historical scene, Africa continued to make contributions to the healing discipline all the way up into our own century. And that Africa still, quiet as it's kept, still has a vast amount to teach us about the healing discipline. So if I don't leave you with anything at all, let me leave you with those thoughts, and thank you for your patience and attention. The reports that have emanated out of Kenya over the last 12 to 18 months about the development of an anti-AIDS medication called Kemetic. I think one of the things that it is possible for me to say, and by the way, I do not speak as an expert, I do not speak as an authority on AIDS, and there may be other individuals in this room who can. There is no evidence worthy of the name from an epidemiological point of view that can tie AIDS to an origin in Africa. That is, again, a surmise. It is not an incontrovertible fact. There is no evidence that the green monkey virus in itself produces AIDS. The epidemiology of AIDS is also all wrong for an African origin. But without getting into that too much, because we could
go back and forth on that issue for a long time. I don't think this is the forum to do that. Cameron, for the last 12 to 18 months, 12 to 18 months ago, there were reports coming out of Kenya that they had developed an anti-AIDS medication that was getting some very, very interesting and positive results in terms of cures. Not cures, but at least remission of symptoms. The problem is, as I see it, is that there has been what I would call, well, either a blackout or a whiteout, depending on how you want to look at that, of information about Cameron. There was an AIDS conference at Morehouse School of Medicine about 15 months ago when the question of Cameron came up. Since then, I just have not heard much of anything about it. Why there has been no serious study of Cameron is something that I don't really understand, inasmuch as almost any other cure, quack cure or otherwise, has been investigated. Or people have made comments about or said something about it. To my knowledge, no one has ever said whether Cameron works or doesn't work from the point of view of being tested, either in a study population or in laboratory or otherwise. So I don't know what to make of that. Perhaps there are a lot of other people who really spend their careers not only studying AIDS, but doing research in AIDS, keeping tabs on the whole issue of AIDS, and they're in this community, in Washington and Atlanta, they might be better informed than I am. But what has struck me is the lack of interest in, or a lack of interest in Cameron by the scientific community, whether if only to prove that it doesn't work. Even if you assume that it doesn't work, you haven't proved that it doesn't work. And so there seems to be some assumptions about Cameron that are not that are a priori assumptions. And really, that's all I want. That's really all I really feel like I can say about Cameron at this point.
Questions have to come over here.
Oh, I'm told that I'll take this question, but from then on, questions have to come down over here to my right, near the flag. Yes.
Visited Baltimore about 12 months ago during the African History Conference at the High Radio. We made efforts to negotiate with him to take a close look at his work, and he was not very forthcoming. Under pressure from interest groups in the United States and from patient groups locally, patient advocates, I personally made extensive efforts to investigate the credit of Cameron, and they were not very forthcoming. I have a friend from Walter Reed who is currently doing research work in Kenya and associated with the research council that was related to Cameron. And the impression is that the whole Cameron story is really a charade. So I really do not want to retract from your
by the way,
from the stature of your purpose here tonight to dwell on issues like Cameron. But let me use this opportunity to mention that in Ghana and in the Ivory Coast, there are other traditional healers. I receive a lot of information from those communities who claim that they have effective agents against antiretroviral agents, but because of policy issues and issues of trust, they are having a lot of difficulty finding people on this part of the Atlantic to work with to find the efficacy. But I think the issue of Cameron retracts from a lot of possibilities that might exist in Africa in relationship to it.
Okay, I will accept that as a definitive statement on this at this time. I don't really think that this is the place to go into that. Thank you very much. That really enlightens me as to where the issue stands, and I certainly was unaware. I get asked about it all the time. I think there's one thing that is true in the medical science community. There always has to be corroboration for any claims.
Dr. Finch, there is a clinical trial going on in California. Dr. Wilbur Jordan, I think, do you know him? Yes. Well, we are aware of the clinical trials that are going on. The preliminary work has been done by the World Health Organization. And the claims about Cameron, the preliminary work, and do not support the claims of Cameron. And the other fact is that the cell lines they were using, they apparently imported them from part. So they cannot even make claims about proprietary rights over whatever agents we're telling. It's a big political issue in Kenya.
Yeah, obviously.
I really think it retracts from the stature of your term.
Okay, let's close it since we can turn this into an AIDS discussion, and I don't think that's quite what we want to do tonight. I'm not saying that the issue is not important, that we don't need some give and take back and forth about it. AIDS, as you know, is an extraordinarily complicated and complex problem. There are many sides to the issue, many points of view, and we still don't really have a handle on all dimensions of the disease. I will say, though, that I do know firsthand that there are reports that out of the traditional sector of medicine, there are, shall we say, experiments going on with treatments, shall we say, for AIDS. That's all I can say. And I think perhaps that's all we need to say right now. Perhaps we ought to move to another question. Yes.
Dr. Finch, I want to know, have you studied any of the Oriental medicines? And would you possibly tell me, if you have, did you find any correspondences to the ancient Kemetic type, or would you think they would be have more relation to Western type medicine?
The question was, what do I know, or have I studied Oriental medicine? What is its relation to ancient Cam? And is it more likely related to Western medicine? No, I have not specifically studied Eastern medicine as such. I know something, or I've read a little bit about Ayurvedic medicine, and of course acupuncture, traditional Chinese herbal medicine. It is absolutely utterly clear that the traditional medicine around the world have more common with each other, no matter where you find them, than they do with what we today call Western medicine. The concepts are different, the applications are different, their ideas, everything, the whole philosophical grounding of traditional medicine around the world is different. Let me say this, though, as it relates to acupuncture. Now, I got a letter about 6 months ago, or 8 months ago, from a young woman in Chicago, or actually no, it wasn't Chicago, she's from England, asking me if I could send her information about the African or Kemetic antecedents of acupuncture. Well, I didn't respond to that simply because I knew nothing about the subject, and there was nothing in my reading or studying that would prepare me to answer such a question. However, what was interesting to me is that on my last trip to Senegal in October, November, I had to study about the people themselves the people among whom these traditional healers that we were doing a survey lived among. These were the Serer. The Serer people are an ethnic group in Senegal, and the healers, 383 of them, are Serer healers. And so if you are going to if you're going to try to understand anything about the way they practice the healing art, you have to understand something about their worldview, their culture, their religions, their symbols, their myths, etc., etc. And there is a book out in French, and I had to read it in French, it's not in English, called Pangoul. Pangoul is just the name of the spiritual entities that inhabit the Serer world. It was written by a man named Henri Gabon, who lived 40 years among the Serer, very much like Griot had lived about 35 or 36 years among the Dogon. But he started talking about sort of the Serer notions of the individual and its relationship to the environment, to nature, to the spirit world. And he started talking about the Serer notion of lines of force. That's the only way I can describe it. Lines of force that sort of emanate out of the natural world, but really sort of suffuse the body itself. That the body itself has lines of force through which energy pulsates, and that it is possible for certain individuals to directly control what the Serer call these lines of force. Now, the reason why I thought that was interesting, because to me, it sounded very much like, or it made me think of the meridians, the idea of meridians that you find in acupuncture. Also, of course, traditional Chinese medicine as is Ayurvedic medicine, is very substantially grounded in what we think call, for lack of a better term, herbalism, as is traditional African medicine. And in a very close, intimate relationship with the spirit world. So, without being able to say any much more about Oriental medicine, whether it be Ayurvedic in India or acupuncture and herbal medicine in China, what I do know suggests a much stronger connection or closeness to traditional African medicine than what we think of as Western medicine, simply because, shall we say, the premises on which that medicine is based is closer to the African than it is the Western.
I had one comment to make and two questions. The comment had to do with the glider that you showed, which you mentioned in Texas one time. There's been some other subsequent research at the site where it was found that they were doing some using chemical means of propulsion, for instance, like mixing things like dropping baking soda into a skin full of vinegar to generate a gaseous exhaust or motor force. So there has been some work done to investigate.
That's new information for me, so that's interesting. I didn't know that.
The two questions I have are, you spoke of the Rind and the Moscow mathematical papyri. I'm aware of publications in English dealing with the
Rind, yes.
Papyri, but none with Moscow.
Yes.
Are there any in English?
The only thing I have seen on the Moscow papyrus really is secondary sources. And what I would refer you to is a book called Mathematics in the Time of the Pharaoh by Richard Gillens. That is the classic, sort of, in that area. Check out the Jot. Of course, dealt with traditional African mathematics in Civilization of Barbarism. I have not seen an English language version of any of the other. There's the Moscow mathematical papyrus, the Berlin mathematical papyrus, there's the Kebun. There's about 4 or 6 of them. But the only one that I know that has been rendered into English is the Rind of mathematical papyrus, and that's because it is the most complete as far as I know.
Okay. The other question was, you gave a quote that dealt with symbolic proofs and how they were not dealing with the theoretical aspects of it. What was the source of that?
That was from Richard Gillens. In fact, that's I'm sorry, I can give you the actual page.
But it's in there. I have
Yes.
agree with it.
Yeah. That's a direct quote from Richard Gillens, who was an MIT professor of history of mathematics or history of science.
First of all, brother, I'd like to thank you for your gift to us. And I'd like to deal with 2 points kind of tied together. Now, early on, you were mentioning dealing with term genetics and saying that genetics determines no race.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now, with that into account, can you deal with the melanin factor and also the physical as well as the mental and spiritual characteristics of anything that has a genetic makeup? And at the same time, tie it into how maybe certain people who identify by those certain genetic codes can be identified as who are raised by that. And what I want you to tie together with that is dealing with, for example, the European misuse of things they stole and used from us and our addiction to their misuse of it today and what we call modern medicine. What would you consider, first of all, if we're dealing with an emergency situation and we have to take ourselves away from that European addiction of medicine, what are the #1 massive killers of European medicine that are descended upon our people right now that needs to be totally taken away from, whether it's inoculations, whether it's their hospital or hospice centers or what have you? Can you deal with that?
Not all, no. Simply because constraints of time. That sounds like a symposium, a colloquium, or a long-term. And I'm not going to be able to answer all that question. Let me just give you a perspective on the business of genetics. If, in fact, all 5.5 million people descend from one genetic line, which they do, Africa. If, in fact, what we call the various races are variants from that one genetic line induced by climatic or environmental changes in a particular geographical position, then in fact, people who belong to that genetic line are in fact closer to one another than they are different. Now, I understand what's behind your question. I'm sorry, black people and white people belong to the same race. That's all there is to it. Yeah, that is the human race. Now, what happened in history is cultural, political, social. I understand that. I understand everything behind it. But finding a genetic basis for it is very, very problematic. What is a race? Or what is a species? A species is a group of plant animals whose male and female members can mate and produce fertile offspring. By that definition, all people on this planet belong to the same species. Genetically, our differences are minuscule at the genetic level. Now, it is true, a minuscule change, a difference in genetic code can translate into a rather dramatic change in phenotype, which is to say, a small change in gene can translate into a rather large change in the realm of observable characteristics. Now, what Josh says, and I have to agree with him, it is those observable characteristics, it is a phenotype which determines racial characteristics that has been most important in the geopolitical history of the world for the last 500 years, 1,000 years. Some people say if you deal with the whole Aryan invasion of India, it goes back 4,000 years. So the point is that people tend, if you will, not absolutely tend, to segregate themselves according to phenotype. But if I were to give you 1,000, if you were to give me 1,000 random samples of blood, and I was able to perform genetic tests on all of them, I would not be able to assign every last one of them to a race. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference genetically between those 1,000 people if all you had was serum samples that you were doing genetic tests on. So that's what I mean, that there is no genetic basis for race. There isn't. Race as a concept can only be phenotypic as well as socio-cultural and political. Now, that does not mean that I am blind to or unaware of the fact that in history, the segregation by race has led to, shall we say, a massive attack on one race by another. It was more than an attack. There is evidence, by the way, that Africa, before the time of the Europeans, had 600 million people. Africa doesn't have that many people even today. By 1900, Africa's population had gone down to 100 million. So that there was a holocaust of unimaginable proportions that affected Africa. That holocaust definitely has conditioned and determined relationships between peoples today, particularly race relations. Check on the job says, yes, it is possible that environmental conditions can shape the psychological profile of an entire people. It can turn them into, it can make them aggressive. It could make them competitive. It could make them people who seem to be addicted to domination, power, and control. But what is there a genetic basis for that? That is something that I'm not prepared to say. But check out the job in trying to understand what happened in history. Why did this one people perpetuate this Holocaust on another? I mean, what drove them to do it? What motivated them to do it? What motivated them to commit essentially the greatest crime against humanity ever committed by any people at any time? And we only have partial answers. If you know, and we're not even sure about those answers. But no, I cannot subscribe to necessarily a genetic basis for that. Now, the thing about white medicine does not do. They don't even recognize there's a spiritual dimension to healing. Now, that is the one thing I learned when I went to Africa. If there's anything that America lacks, and when I say America, you know, we're in the body of the beast, so it affects us too. The spirit, in a sense, does not live here. And the only way to know it is by comparison. You have to go to Africa to know what a living spirit that animates an entire culture, an entire ecology, an entire people is. And it is living there and it's real. It isn't here. I know it. Or it isn't here in the way in which it can animate and the way in which it can uplift people. So it is, shall we say, that complete alienation from what I call the spirit that is at the heart of the malaise of Western medicine. Because once you make that the center, as African medicine does, of the healing art, then all the things that we say are wrong with Western medicine become epiphenomena, they become artifacts, they become insignificant, because then everything serves the process of healing by virtue of the spirit. Because we cure in Western medicine, we don't heal. It's different. Healing is the process by which you harmonize yourself and the spirit that dwells within with the whole world around you. Family, nature, environment, the cosmos. I need that. Literally the cosmos. Everything interacts with everything else. I know I'm going on and rambling, but the question was such that I have to deal with these questions. So that But curing does not always involve healing. Because curing is frequently the elimination of symptoms. But that is not healing. And you see, this is why I've been completely fascinated by traditional African medicine, because healing is at the very center of that work. Now, people ask me, well, Dr. Finch, you're going to go over there when you come back, you're going to become a traditional healer? No, that's not quite what it's about. I mean, it isn't as simple as that. Not by a long shot. But yes, the process is slow. The process is deliberate. And it is an evolutionary process. Once upon a time, our people used to think in terms of 26,000-year cycles. Now, when you start thinking in terms of 26,000-year cycles, a century or even a millennium isn't very much time. We have hard enough time thinking a year ahead. We don't even have the patience to deal with things. We don't even have the patience to contend with things that unfold over a period of weeks or months, let alone years or decades, or even after we're gone from this planet. So, all I'm saying is that I think you're getting to the heart of the question, but it just needs to be phrased in a different way. And to me, it is phrased by posing the conflict or the contrast between curing and healing, and there has to be a fusion of those two processes. And for me, the clues or the signposts or the guides that can help me find, and not just me, but help those of us who are interested in this achieve that fusion is in Africa. And for me, nowhere else. That's why I'm over there. That's why I'm doing this. Now, will I find the answers in my lifetime? No, very likely not. I'm not supposed to. I mean, if it's that simple, well, we wouldn't be in the problems we are in now. But it is any more than check on the job. Found all the answers to the questions he posed. Imhotep didn't find all the answers to the questions that he posed. You're not supposed to. So, I know what you did is that you opened up a door for a rather complex discussion, and it's hard to answer those things, but let me see if I can just break it down and sort of bring it down. No, there is no fundamental genetic difference between white and black. Just isn't. It just biologically there's no evidence for it. If not, we basically couldn't breed, and we do, obviously. Black and white do breed and produce fertile offspring. Now, the difference that I think that you're referring to has to do with a historical, geopolitical, cultural, social, psychological profile that, yes, we could spend a lot of time trying to analyze and get to the bottom of. Yes, it did commit enormous crimes against humanity. But trying to look for a genetic basis for that, I just can't. I myself cannot follow that line of thinking. The second thing is, as I say, the difference between modern medicine and traditional medicine is just, as I said, the difference between cure and healing. And although I understand the need to cure, to me that has to be the first step only in the healing process, because the healing process is spiritual, mental, and psychological, more so than it is physical. Because you do the mental, physical, and psychological, and the physical will take care of itself. That's basically Africa's idea. Even though clinical, empirical, scientific medicine, as we saw, began in Africa. But it is not the greatest part of the healing art. I know that took too much time. Maybe we can have one or two more questions. One.
I was to Africa in 1917 and met Ivory Boer.
Yeah.
And are you familiar with this word?
Oh, what's his name?
Boer. B-O-U-A-A.
He was Ivorian or is he from Ghana? There's a Ghanaian named Boer and Ando. There's two of them. There's a couple of them in Ghana.
I think his first name was Boer. But what struck me as so different is often we look at the source material as the papyrus, papyrus. Well, what had happened in this particular area, when you go to agriculture, if you find anyone who talks about science before Europe, came to Africa, before colonization, usually comes before.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
Because of Boer in Africa.
Yeah.
All right, and what had happened was someone had hit a bunch of artifacts that had been used in Africa prior to colonization to educate young.
Yeah.
And they had carved mathematical systems,
Yes.
the plants, animals,
Like they did Egypt.
insects. Yeah, they had carved them on brains.
Exactly.
They didn't use the
Yes.
virus, but it's on
Right. Exactly. Well, John talks about that. He talks about how the history of the wall was carved on barks of trees, and the trees, when he came back to them later on in life, had been cut down. You see, so.
He was trying to get them published, and he wanted them published
Yes.
so that in a format so that you could see you could look at them and see the beauty of the system.
Let me say this sort of as a coda to everything we've said. I told this to Theophilus Banger. If you're trying to recover African history, cultural history, the whole piece, African civilization, all that applies, you are jumping into a bottomless pit. You can keep going down, and you can never see the bottom. That's what's fascinating. That's what I said. You can have 1,000 people working on this full time for 3 centuries and never get to the bottom. People have no idea. I don't. Josh did. Oh, what happened in history where Africa is concerned? What Africa contributed? What emerged there? We got the fairest glimmer of what happened. And Egypt was just the latest study of something that's been going on for thousands of years. And as Chancellor Williams says, the black people of African descent, want to know how far they have come down on the scale of things in history. All you have to do is go with Patricia Newton, or Asa Dillon. Asa's not doing it anymore, but Patricia or me, and don't let anything stand in the hypostyle hall of Karnak Temple. And then that contrast tells you more than anything. That that juxtaposition. And we have no idea. Believe me, you think this is impressive? It's kindergarten stuff.
Can I let Dr. Harris jump in?
Yes, please.
More of a comment than a question, but keeping with your previous comment. As we look at the body as a small representation of the larger universe,
Of the universe, exactly.
looking at the cellular nature of the body and its ramifications. Then we look to the universe, to our cosmos as we know it. We think of things as the black hole. Patrick written on this as well as Dr. King in reference to the black hole being the blind spot at the back of our eye, and thus the entrance point, say, or our black hole for our body. I thought it was interesting, and it's perhaps a question in reference to your speaking of the Cyrus group, and with the Great Pyramid, when the NASA astronauts in the 1970s, some of the NASA reports which are now made public information noted on the moon pyramids
Pyramidal.
equal to the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And further,
Mars, too.
on the spectrum, right, the idea and the theories that these were navigational guides, and of the millennium much further back than we can even imagine. But again, as they look for the white star, perhaps it is a black star that we're looking for in the universe, another black hole.
No, wait a minute. I think what I want to do. Read a book called Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. James Wood and I talked about this. Where he talks about a singularity. You know what a singularity is? Singularity is a place where the law of physics breaks down. There's only 2 places where that happens. At the moment of creation and a black hole.
The evolution from a black hole into light and birth.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's a whole, like ancient Kemetic says, out of the darkness comes light. The light, the darkness is always the womb, light, situation of consciousness. Which is why, if you, that's what you would incarnate. You got to incarnate. Because I was reading this in a book called, by Norman Lockyer, called Dawn of Astronomy. It's oriented precisely to the western hills in such a way that the setting sun, at the time it was built, at a certain time of year would flash a light right on the Holy of Holies. And the Holy
and understood the relationship between darkness and light, and how you, and they even apparently understood the way in which light interacts with the retina to produce vision. And as the bus go along, they would talk about this not only in the physical and material, they would all talk about it in the cosmic as well as on the metaphysical and mystical plane. So that the earth was literally a mirror of heaven and vice versa. So this is the reason why you can look into heaven and it will be a book telling you everything that's going on earth. Past, present, and future. That's why I'm getting into astronomy, because the book is up there. Who? Oh, okay.
We don't have time, brother. We just have to bring her back.
No, we can't do that tonight. Don't hurt. Hammer don't hurt, they don't hurt. That's too much. That's a little bit more than we have time for today.
And we get back to before we break, Linda Carroll needs to sing the registration table before she leaves. Linda Carroll. And as you all finalize your address so we can get out of here, please remember that February 29th, 1992, Dr. Joseph Benny Ackerman and Oscar Quaid will be here at Copping State College on 4 p.m. February 29th. On behalf of Ms. Dog, the Dog Kemetic Study Group, and Positive Forces Productions, we thank you. May the Creator bless you and hotel.
The achievement test, and of course achievement tests have been around since human beings have been around in one form or another. The American contribution to the achievement test is the standardized, especially the multiple choice, machine scored, therefore mass produced, therefore cheap instrument. It has some problems associated with it, mainly the question of whether what is on the test, since you're making a state or a national test, is actually what's taught in the schools. And schools actually have local control. Generally speaking, there is a gross mismatch between those two things: what's taught on what's taught in school, and what is actually written on standardized achievement tests. And it's almost as if you really can't correct that problem, but it's not something that would necessarily cause us to stop testing. There are probably ways to figure out some use for the bias test. That's not where the problem is in testing, as I see it, or at least not the major problem. The major problem is with the second type of test, and that's where the history of assessment is important. And the second type of test is the one that is supposed to be a measure of the mind, the IQ test, the intelligence quotient test, that some people erroneously call an intelligence test. And that test was actually developed in Europe, in France, and the person most popularly associated with the use of the test in the schools is, of course, Alfred Binet and his colleague Simon. And so Binet and Simon, in response to a request from the French government to look at this massive influx of children that were being enfranchised so that they could go to school for the first time, poor kids, they said, well, maybe we ought to look at these kids and see if they need special help. And so that's the kind of problem they posed to this psychologist, Binet. And Binet, being really a model professional, did what professionals should do. He framed the question the way the professional would see it more than the way the public policymaker would see it. He said, well, really, maybe what I want to do is to find out if I can create an assessment instrument that will tell me where a child is now. in order that I can find out what I have to do to make that child do well in school. And this is really the nub of what I want to say. That his assumption was that that children who did poorly in school could be helped. In other words, that their intelligence could be boosted. Literally, the intelligence itself could be boosted. His concept of intelligence could be boosted with what he called mental orthopedics or mental therapeutics. So he did create a test which became known as the Binet IQ test, Binet-Simon, and he also, however, created a remedial education approach, what you might call special education strategies, remedial strategies. And he worked with children, and he found that he could raise their scores on his test, which is what he had expected. So he created not only a test, but a way to help kids. The concept, as it came across the Atlantic to the United States, largely the work of people like Louis Terman at Stanford University.
What time period are we talking about?
Terman's first test would be 1916, Stanford University. And it became the Stanford Binet or the Terman Binet. And it really shouldn't have the name Binet at all, because Terman turned Binet's concept, both concepts, inside out. The first concept he turned inside out was the idea that intelligence could change with good teaching. And for Terman, intelligence was fixed and could never change. And therefore, the goal of the testing process using intelligence tests in schools is to find out who's dumb and who's smart and to put them together in those two different, or three groups actually, smart, medium, and dumb. That therefore, for Terman, he also turned the second concept inside and out, which was that you can't help someone with a low IQ to become high functioning. So where Binet had actually conceived of it and done it, Terman conceived the opposite, and of course nothing happened as a result. And those are two models for thinking about the use of intelligence tests in school.
The earlier was produced to help.
The earlier was produced to help, and the other was produced
to weed out.
To weed out, to place in custody, to rationalize, to justify. Now, what's important about this is that it wasn't just Terman who bought this idea, but Terman's idea was bought by the educational establishment in the United States of America and the psychological establishment. So we have been using that model of thought about how to use tests since 1916, really, and it has had a devastating effect on the organization of the school, or at least it's been associated with a dysfunctional school organization, and it has had a devastating effect on the lives of children as a consequence of the rupture of the school, because we actually created schools to fit what we got out of IQ tests. We run gifted classes, normal classes, and retarded classes. And then we even break the retarded into other subgroups, severe retardation, mild retardation. And we do this with the help of tests. The funny thing about it, though, is that in the last, some of us have been arguing about these things now for almost 30 years to try to change the model back to Binet, back to the model that Binet had. That is that the use of standardized IQ tests, not achievement tests, but standardized IQ tests, could be justified in school only on the ground that you learn something that would enable children to benefit more from school than they would otherwise. Now, the funny part about that is that we now have a whole body of research that shows that was never true. In other words, that the diagnoses that we make are invalid, and that the services that we provide do not work. In fact, I'm carrying right here this article from May 1991 in the Harvard Educational Review by Thomas Scetv. It's called the Special Education Paradox. And that, if I can sum it up, that's basically what he does, is bring the research literature together for people who support testing in special education as it now is, and people who want to make changes in it. And the funny part about it is that they all agree that the diagnostic process does not work. The ones who support and the ones who oppose. They also all agree that the treatment process does not work. That means giving kids special services doesn't create instructional benefits. Kids don't learn more once they're treated in these special ways. And both groups agree, those who favor and those who oppose. Well, this is an incredible situation. If you get both groups agreeing that the system is not working, then why have we invested 70 years in a system that's designed based upon and associated with the invalid use of IQ tests? So you can see that the problem is usually misstated in public discourse.
But was there an ulterior political motive for the use of the IQ test?
Well, for some people, well, the answer is yes and no. There's an excellent book by Leon Kamen called The Politics and Science of IQ. It's interesting that you asked the question because the title of that book embodies the answer to your question, that there is a science of IQ, and there's that group of people who are seeing it that way and trying to use the IQ test scientifically, and that's invalid, by the way, as Kamen and others have shown. But in addition to that, there's a politics of IQ. In other words, there are people like the creator of the IQ test in America, Lewis Terman, who himself had very interesting political ideas, especially racist ideas about black people and other people. And for example, he said no amount of voting, no amount of education would ever make us capable voters or good citizens. In other words, we couldn't be helped. Our IQs were too low as a group.
The person who
created the Stanford Binet. That's Terman, Lewis Terman. That was his view. In other words, he not only had that view, but was associated with a whole body of psychologists at the time who belonged to groups like the Human Breeders Association, who believed in social Darwinism, that it was their job to act to purify the races and to get rid of the dumb people. And they had something called the Eugenics Research Association, and many of the prominent psychologists of the time belonged to the Eugenics Research Association. So that's political. That's not just, it's not just educational. That's making political choices about who lives and who doesn't. For example, sterilizations were conducted in California based on the use of IQ tests. And people lobbied the state of California. They passed compulsory sterilization laws for people with low IQs.
So how widely are IQ tests used today?
Very widely, very widely. Throughout the United States, it's probably certain that you're going to get one or more individual or group IQ tests on your way through school.
So when do you, using their measurement and concept, when do you know that you're smart, and when do you know that you just quite don't have it?
Using their measurement and concept, there's a range of scores that have been developed. Usually IQ tests have an average score, which they call a mean of 100, and then they have a range above and below for the first middle group, which is called a standard deviation. And for example, I think on the Binet, it's 115, 116, or 16 points up and 16 points down will give you your middle group. And then if you go outside those boundaries, you get into a good group and a bad group. And then into outside those boundaries again into a gifted group and into a severely retarded group.
Just your explanation of that is making me know that I must be in the lower group.
In the very lowest group.
Is there any truth to the charge, and you've already touched on this, that these tests are culturally biased?
We see the direct answer to that is yes, they are culturally biased. However, that really is not the problem with the IQ test. Its cultural bias is not its problem. The fundamental problem with the use of IQ tests in education is their utility. In other words, even if it's unbiased as an estimate of what a kid is capable of doing right now, in using it, do you learn something that will enable you to make the child learn more than if you didn't give the test? Mm-hmm. That is the problem. And unfortunately, that's not the topic on the table when people discuss IQ tests. They rather discuss the cultural bias. For example, I can illustrate the cultural bias just by telling you that a large part of the IQ test score is related to the type of vocabulary that you have. Mm-hmm. You know, if you know certain words, you're going to get a better score than if you don't know those words. And we also know that the words that you know are a function of your social group. Mm-hmm. Okay, right. That's a bias. You know, in other words, if I sit down at a test session and I'm looking at words that I've never seen before, and you're trying to make estimates of what I'm capable of doing based on something that I've never had an opportunity to practice, you can see the bias right there.
So is it not only culturally biased, but maybe even class bias?
It's culturally biased, class bias, sex bias. It's biased in any way where one group has had more practice than another group on the things that the test demands. Okay. Then it's biased toward the group that's had the less practice.
Okay, well, as you know, that these tests are not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. They're here with us for a while. They're going to be with us for a while. And many students just want to know how can they perform better on these tests.
Well, okay, that's interesting, too. And I think the first thing that they need to know, one way to perform better is to be clear in your own mind about what the test is and what it does. Because many students believe that the test actually is an X-ray of their mental powers, and it isn't. And so you have to put that out of your mind and realize that as far as IQ tests are concerned, it is a game. Okay, in that case, since you don't have the power, you know, we don't have the power to stop the game, but you do have the power to win the game. In other words, that if you decide that that it's important to get a high IQ score, you can improve your scores, especially.
Well, let me stop you and ask you this. I shouldn't do this, but what is it used for? As a gateway to what?
Well, you know that IQ tests are used to determine what kind of course you get to take in school, the curriculum that you're going to be offered. An IQ test is sometimes used in the criminal justice system to determine whether you're going to go on parole or not. An IQ test determines whether you go to college or not, whether you get a scholarship or not, whether you will be an officer or an enlisted man in the Army or not, whether you will move into management or into something else in the corporate world. In other words, there are many, many uses of IQ tests as a gatekeeping device. Okay. And so that's what the use is.
Okay, now how to do better on the test?
Okay, this is an extremely important thing especially for African people to know, because our scores tend to be about, as they say, a standard deviation below average. You know, that there's that kind of mismatch between the means of African American group and a European American group, for example. There's a nice book that was written by a man who used to work for the Educational Testing Service his name is Paul Jacobs. He wrote a book for parents on how to raise the children's IQ scores. And it's important that he wrote it because as an item writer for the Educational Testing Service, he was familiar with the little tricks of the trade that have nothing to do with intellect. But if you know these tricks, you can raise your scores. And so, in effect, what he did was to tell trade secrets in this book, which is almost hard to get. In fact, I think the book is out of print, but you can get it in libraries. You know, libraries have it. And the title of the book is called Up the IQ by Paul Jacobs. And I hardly recommend every parent get Up the IQ because there is an explanation of how these questions are written and also how to respond to them with examples, practice examples. And when you practice these examples, it will raise the scores of low-performing children just by being exposed to things like this that they haven't been exposed to before. Teaches them how to think critically about the kinds of questions that they're being asked. And that would be one way. A second way is, and most African Americans don't know this, but people who are fluent do know it, and most of us are not affluent, so we don't know. But coaching works. In other words, I'm talking about commercial coaching classes like Stanley Kaplan, and I'm thinking of the Princeton Review. And the particular tests that they coach for that are important, which are used like IQ tests. They may not be called IQ tests, but that's exactly what they are. And that is the Scholastic Aptitude Test and the American College Test, ACT and SAT. And not only those tests, but all major standardized tests are tests for which coaching is available, usually through these two coaching services. But in addition to that, the NAACP has had coaching services for those two tests as well, and they are very successful in helping to raise scores. And what's important about these tests is that some years ago at Harvard University, there were two professors, Warner Slack and Douglas Porter, who wrote an article in the Harvard Educational Review summarizing the coaching literature, and they talked about how you could raise scores almost 100 points, maybe per section on the SAT. And they were challenged academically on this by testing companies. And ultimately, the Federal Trade Commission got into the act because if you have a testing company like the Educational Testing Company that's saying that our scores can't be raised by coaching, and they in fact can be raised by coaching, and that's a false statement. And they used to have that in their literature, that you can't do much about raising scores. Well, it turns out you can do a great deal about raising scores, and especially for African Americans. And so the Federal Trade Commission conducted an independent study, not one paid for by the testing companies or even by Slack and Porter, but by FTC, and they found that indeed you could raise scores about 30 points per section. That's 60 points overall on the SAT, and that's a substantial increment of change. Then a really interesting thing happened. A man named Stroud was hired by one of the testing companies to review the Federal Trade Commission study because they wanted to challenge that. Well, in the process of challenging it, he confirmed the Federal Trade Commission study, but he also asked another question by pulling black people out as a group and looking to see if you took black people by themselves, did they benefit from coaching as much as white people? And what he found in his small sample was that black people got from 2 to 3 times more from a Kaplan-type coaching course than white people did. And of course, that to me is an incredibly important piece of information. And there's a reason for it.
What is that reason?
Well, the reason is very simple, that most black people are unfamiliar with the type of material, and most of the people who have been taking the test before had many opportunities, either through their normal vocabulary and normal associations and income levels or what have you, or even through coaching, because especially in private schools. Elite private schools know that you can teach people how to pass these tests, and that's part of their curriculum. But most of us don't go to elite private schools. We go to public schools. And so for that reason, we don't know and even feel guilty and think that we're cheating if we practice the type of questions that we're going to have on the test. And everybody else, if that's true, then everybody else is cheating.
But this is the way other people are doing it.
This is how other people are doing it.
Before we even get to the test, what can parents do in terms of modeling for their children to get them off to a good start?
There are a couple basic things that parents can do, and it isn't fair to call upon parents to imitate the professional behavior of teachers. It isn't fair to expect that they can do all the different kind of things that teachers can do. Nevertheless, there are some very powerful things that a parent, even without any kind of specialized preparation, can do. One is the parents can make it a habit to read with their children. Just in general, just for fun. Read as much as you possibly can with your children. Read to your children, have your children read to you. Those are the kinds of things.
And that's very important.
That's extremely important. You get the habit of reading, You get a joy out of reading. You get an attitude toward reading in that way. The second thing is you can play word games. You know, one of the single most important things that you can do for a child is to go get the list of words that test makers use. And you can buy these books on how to pass high on standardized tests from college bookstores. You know, how to pass high on the SAT, how to pass high on the ACT. And those books have vocabulary words. If you study those vocabulary words specific, and you're only talking about maybe 10, as many as maybe 12, 1,500 words is what you're talking about. A very small group of words that are common to many standardized tests. In fact, when I first came to Georgia in 1980, the young man who got the #1 score in Georgia, he was a young white boy, he got the #1 score in the SAT, I believe it was. And the way he did it was that over the summer, he had studied the vocabulary associated with the test. So, in other words, to make vocabulary study, reading and practicing words together, certain words, not just any words, but the words that are going to be on the test, so that the kid becomes comfortable with that standardized testing vocabulary. Then they will have an A.